maybe I can just start introducing you guys. So we have today we have, well, now in this session we have David Heyman, who is a professor here at UT. We have again Sean Connelly, who is an independent practicing architect in Hawaii with After Oceanic. And we have also Alicia Lazzaroni, who is an assistant professor at Aarhus in Denmark and part of Animali Domestici, domestic animals, with Antonio, who was with us during the previous session. Previously worked in Bangkok, South Asia in general. And then we should have Coleman Coker with us, who is also a professor here at UT, so I'm sure he will be joining briefly. Now, before I forget, I posted in the chat the links to I don't know if you can see them now that you've joined later or not, David. And
no, not yet.
So, yeah. Okay, so I'll post it again. It's just basically links to the Miro boards from the previous assignments and the last one, if you want to kind of look at it as we're talking. But I know that you also got the links to the PDF, so that was kind of the official final presentation that they were all asked to upload. But I will do that in a moment. Now, Alicia has already seen the work and Sean knows it as well, but for you, David, a little bit of an introduction. I don't know if you had a chance to read the syllabus.
I did.
You did, okay.
Yeah.
So maybe the introduction is not that necessary, but one thing I just wanted to emphasize is that in this studio, really, the focus on plants and architecture kind of receive the equal attention. So this is probably one reason for which the architectural component might not be as developed as in some other studios, but really the basic ambition for me was to expose the students of architecture to plants and turn the plant into protagonist rather than just a decoration in a drawing. So that was really important. And the other really fundamental thing was the collaboration with Sean Connelly, who is here and who is based on Hawaii, and we would never have come up with this idea without him telling me about the nursery and having the collaboration or the support from Rick Barbosa, who runs the nursery and who is also the co-owner of the site that we're working on. So this was really important, and that direct connection. Otherwise, I think we can just start then if you're familiar with the brief. And I have 3 projects in this session, so we really need to make sure that we give equal attention to each of them. So guys, please just take 15 minutes to present, so we have like 25 minutes for the conversation. Okay. Otherwise, it's I'm just gonna shut up and leave it to our reviewers, and it's Amaya and Amir first. Amir, by the way, is from Hawaii and on the island right now. So he's our only Hawaiian
on Oahu.
Student. Yes.
Wow.
Yeah, on Oahu.
Okay, it's all yours, guys.
All right. Hi, guys. My name is Amir Mirza.
And I'm Amaya Lucas.
And this is the Ohia Lehua Center for Healing. As one of the most recognizable and common plants throughout all of Hawaii, the Ohia Lehua is a beautiful myrtle that should be a staple in any native Hawaiian garden. Befitting of its scientific name and found on all of the main Hawaiian islands except for Ni'ihau and Kaho'olawe, Metrosideros polymorpha come in a variety of forms, habitats, and elevations. The Ohia's high variability allows the species to exist naturally from shoreline to mountaintop, dry, bare lava rock to moist rainforest, and from small shrubs a few inches off the ground to towering trees upwards of 150 feet.
The Ohia Lehua is a pioneer species, and it is often the first plant to grow on fresh lava flows. And it's a very important plant for Hawaii's ecology and biodiversity. It is a very important species for many pollinators, serving as their primary habitat, as well as several other endangered tree species. And as well, its propensity to absorb water helps to recharge aquifers and protects the area's watersheds.
Due to its strength and widespread growth, Ohia lehua wood was a frequent material used for the erection of structures. The wood was commonly used for posts and rafters in traditional Hawaiian hale or homes.
Ohia is undergoing an unprecedented crisis at the moment. It's currently being afflicted by what's known as rapid Ohia death. This is caused by the fungus ceratocystis, which disrupts the water flow within the Ohia lehua tree. And this disease is very rapidly spread throughout forests and can kill a tree within a matter of about 2 weeks. So as a result, we've seen a big decline in the cultural usages of the Ohia lehua, and there is currently an order issued prohibiting the transfer of the lehua between the islands.
He ali'i ka aina he kaua ke kanaka. Land is the chief and man is its servant. Similar to the crisis affecting Ohia, there's a vast disparity for access to healthcare between Native Hawaiians and other demographics. Along with that, research shows that seedlings of the Ohia may be resistant to rapid Ohia death, so the Ohia can now begin to heal. And to support this time of healing, we propose a project as a Hawaiian healing space in which guests come to heal themselves, the land, and the threatened lehua. This project comes with precedent, as spaces and organizations like Ho'oluaina and Kalihi Valley already take part in the reciprocal relationship between land and Hawaiians, expressing culture through Hawaiian healing and land management. The center accompanies this through the provision of traditional Hawaiian healing practices like la'au lapa'au or plant medicine, ho'oponopono or healing relationships, or lomi lomi as massage therapy. The Healing Center is located in Haiku Valley in Heia, Oahu. Heia is an ili or subdivision of the Kaneohe Ahu Poa'a on the windward side of Oahu, running from Mauka to Makai, mountain to ocean. Historically, it is a region with considerable agricultural and marine uses, home to several taro patches and the Heia Loko'ia Hawaiian fish pond. Today, Heia is a suburban community, home to a number of Hawaiian-based schools and organizations dedicated to land management, cultivation, and education. The Healing Center accompanies and supports these other initiatives as a Hawaiian space for reflection, healing, and invigoration through the fostering of an intentional relationship with the land.
To truly get to know one's land, it's really important to observe the natural patterns and cycles and record them in memory. In Hawaiian, this integration and observation of the land is called kilo. And it is when one takes note of things such as the wind, the tides, rains, celestial occurrences. Another example is the Hawaiian lunar calendar. And so these observations help practitioners tell when to plant or harvest certain crops or when to cultivate medicinal plants, the best days for fishing, things of that nature. And in the practice of kilo, it's very important to take observations from the same place, to have visible site markers such as mountain peaks. And that way you can more accurately assess the cycles of the land. And we use kilo throughout to inform our project.
So we envision the center to have two main types of guests. Day visitors can schedule healing assessments with on-site practitioners performing lomi lomi or ho'oponopono, or to also pick from the medicinal plants, la'au lapa'au. Long-term guests seeking to heal from various illnesses or sufferings can stay at the facility scheduled around the 28-day lunar calendar. These guests will take part in the Hawaiian healing process while participating in caring for the land, tending to the different planting nodes and experiencing all of what the Aina has to offer. Our site as it stands today is currently overgrown with the likes of several invasive species like strawberry guava and bamboo. So through an analysis of the current land formations on site, we identified certain areas and shapes and points of elevation that allow guests different forms of participation in the project. We arrived on 3 main planting zones that replaced the current invasives on site based on slight changes in the land elevation. And then with a flatter communal path operating as a path of least resistance. And then by tending to the land and its plant life within these zones, visitors center care, the visitors to the center care for and heal themselves.
These 3 zones consist of an agricultural area, a medicinal plant grove, and a very celebrated Ohia Grove. And each of these zones will have an accompanying greenhouse or space to grow saplings. As the plants continue to grow over time, we will incrementally be clearing the surrounding invasives and replanting these zones with the respective plants. And eventually, as these plants continue to mature and we grow more, we will see the rest of the site being infilled with this native reforestation. Eventually, with this process, we foresee it projecting throughout the island and taking these areas that have had to be clear cut and reciting the new Ohia Lehua saplings. So our site is experienced along this primary path that remains level because it follows the contours. It links these 3 zones, and the program is arrayed along it. They're organized as either gateways across the path, bridging between zones dependent on their program or function, or as celebrated destinations along the path. And our journey of healing begins at the entry gate. Here, the guests arrive to a very simple space that has areas to clean their shoes and wash their hands. This is in order to ensure that the fungus does not spread into the site. And this is actions that are being taken currently when people are entering forests around the state. And framed by this entry gate is an Ohia Lehua tree. This will be the first one we plant on the site. And this is to explicitly express and kind of reframe visitors' mindsets of the importance of this ohia and the importance of caring for it and protecting it, as well as ensuring that they're kind of entering the site with the correct frame of mind for their own healing journey. And this act of washing your hands, cleaning your shoes, ensuring that is also an act to symbolically begin your healing process and enter the site from your own personal problems as well.
So the first arrival on the Malka, or toward the mountainside of the site, is the agricultural zone. Here we can see the space for cooking and some gardening spaces and cooking spaces, as well as interior, exterior cooking spaces, and also places to enjoy your meal. Accompanying the eating area would be small office spaces for support staff assisting with the healing center. And then next we arrive at the apothecary and medicinal zone. Here one could envision medicinal plants like noni or olena, which are turmeric, being grown and then being processed at the apothecary across the path to make fermentations, tinctures, and various medicines.
And clustered at the bottom of the medicinal zone, we have our residences. These are for the longer term guests, and these units are incredibly simple spaces with room for little more than just a bed and a desk. These units are inspired by the traditional hale construction, which was typically done, as Amir mentioned at the beginning, using the Ohia Lehua. But given the current restrictions, we're very interested in having our project, the Healing Center, being built with the invasive species of lumber, such as mangrove, albizia, bamboo, strawberry, guava. We're able to find these across the islands, but also specifically on our site for some of these. So we think primarily the strawberry guava would be a particularly good wood to use for this construction. It is a cousin of the Ohia Lehua, and we thus find it very fitting to use it in the wood rafters or the screen construction much in the way that the Ohia Lehua traditionally would have been. And then part of the roofing structure would be thatched using palms or grasses in the traditional way. And here you can see this cluster of residential units with visitors, both long-term and potentially, day visitors, harvesting from that medicinal grove for their own uses. And then at the intersection of the medicinal zone and the Ohia, celebrated Ohia Growth, we have our main lomi lomi and care structure. So this is a very open space with a double height roof, and this open air sort of pavilion-esque area works both as an outdoor massage lomi lomi area or simply a main primary gathering space as needed. Off the side, there are two smaller, more intimate spaces where more private forms of healing, massage conversations may need to take place.
The last zone on the site is the Ohia Growth, and along the path, a visitor will encounter a water structure or fountain as an ode to the importance of Ohia, to the health of the aquifers, and it's also an important point of reflection and pause for people that are walking the site and the various paths. Past this pool and the sapling greenhouse, one arrives at the Kilo observation space built on the highest area on site. The space provides for observation of the world and self. On a certain day, the space aligns with the constellation Makali'i, or the Pleiades, signaling the start of the Hawaiian New Year and harvesting season, also known as Makahiki. And speaking the same language as the entry gate, the intimacy of the space reminds the visitors why they are there. So this is how it's aligned with the Pleiades, and then also with the sun. So Heli Ka'aina He Kawa Ke Kanaka. Land is the chief, man is its servant. And then thank you to the people at Ho'olaina who had me and showed me around and basically inspired the part of the project. So thank you.
Thank you, Amir and Amaya. Thanks. I don't know if Coleman is here or not. David, Alicia, Sean, whenever you want to jump in.
Yes, I can just start. Thanks a lot for your presentation. It was really, really nice. And it was, by chance, it was one of the projects I saw in midterm, and it has developed so much that, I mean, I personally find a lot of improvement and development from the first version. And maybe I would like, I can start highlighting some aspect that I found particularly intriguing and interesting, and maybe add a few observations about that. I mean, first of all, this plant itself has intrigued me a lot in its characteristics, no? The fact that it comes in this different dimension and shapes, and it seems to be like so fragile, no? But at the same time with such a degree of personality. It's yeah, an extremely interesting plant to look carefully at, no? But maybe just moving a little bit on your projects, I found that in the development of it, a much probably sensitive attention to the landscape and the way in which you have organized your strategies along that line, especially also in relation to the tectonic choice that you have presented, and this idea of spanning strategies around time, and therefore time becoming a relevant aspect of your project, and also in a certain way approaching considerations that don't just belong to the notion of site that you have, no? is an interesting consideration that could relate. On maybe different notes or different aspects that are intriguing and can start to, you know, suggest further development. I mean, obviously, you know, giving for granted that I guess it's a very interesting development in the time giving. Maybe can also align to this new specific tectonic and material choice of your huts. All this hatching and eventually, you know, how could a certain set of reflection in relationship to the time component of your project could, you know, like start to appear and interwoven, you know? This hatch roof, I guess that could be, you know, even considered as a potential agent that offer different degree of ventilations. In a lot of cases, these roofs microventilate, they breathe in a lot of time. I'm wondering, no, even if a slightly more if there is any potential articulation on micro opening or almost a different transitions in between what is considered as something that as a clear inside-outside relations, or something that goes in micro, again, definition of breathing could be something that you can consider, like beyond the idea of being conditioned or not. Hatches roofs in traditional architectures have been used again to maintain environments that are very dry inside and cool. I'm thinking about the tectonic of, for example, tobacco barns, that has a very specific way of stratifying certain skins that starts to perform in different way, according again to layers that are basically woven almost around. At the same time, maybe like the use of certain materiality will require a certain degree of maintenance, that will appear over time. The act of taking care of the roof, of repairing it, and maybe you can consider again how certain time considerations could like relate to the process of care, and could eventually like connect to this set of reflection that starts to emerge in the care of the plant, and linked in a set of potential moments that might start to eventually also have a role, in the program that you are considering and mentioning. Maybe again, going back to the plant, I'm wondering if you could, using it a bit more strategically also in the landscape, understanding its different dimensions and also its role as, an agent within the ecosystemic environment that you are proposing. You, for example, show it as an attractor for pollinators, And I found myself, when I was living in the tropics, very much spending a lot of time in watching when, like similar plants were flourishing, like the butterfly, the honeybee, and all these, like sunbirds arriving, and feeding, on that. And I'm wondering almost, the idea of like using it as shrubs or in different parts can almost become a stage, to almost celebrate certain kind of wildlife and a direct involvement, with the visitors, that are actually, like engaged with the landscape, So how it can almost, like work as a component that as a particular agency in relation to the architectural, like element that you have inserted. Maybe I'm just right now leaving a word to the others, but yeah, thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you. David, you're muted.
Maybe I'll jump in.
Yeah.
See Sean there. I really I like the project too, and something that Alicia just said about the pollinators. I know those birds really, really well, and because they're, they do pollinate that particular species of tree, but they don't pollinate it in the zone of the site. They pollinate it because they're largely extirpated from those lowlands, right? And in part because of mosquitoes, and in part because of invasive other species and so forth. But they thrive at a certain level above a certain elevation, right? So that means the trees have to get up to above that elevation in order for the pollination to occur. And just that idea alone got me thinking about the part, like, I like the project a lot. And then for me, the question is, which way would the project go? Looking at it, what are the kinds of weaknesses as young architects? And for me, it has mostly to do with the kind of idea embedded in that problem of the trees, similar to the problem of how the crisis of the local environment means you might actually begin to rethink the systems by which the thing that you make gets meaning. So the planting, like the first significant thing that you guys do is plant a tree in a specific location, but in fact, that location is just a hopeful location for a future that might arrive or might not arrive, right? In that location, the number of pollinators. On the other hand, you could also imagine this kind of active idea of the trees being moved around the island and fundamentally having to, in order quite literally to get them to their pollinators and then bring them back. And it's just like beginning to think about, so much as I think the thing that to me that was the most interesting key to beginning to move your project, like the next stage of development, was the idea of kind of using invasive species for the structural frame, right? And going, all right, already the notion of the crisis in which we're operating requires us to rethink the mechanisms by which we both assemble and then mediate and then obtain meaning from the building itself. So for me, the parts about the project where I think you could push harder are actually material ones. I mean, the question, for example, of the frame is intriguing to me. It has, on a cultural level, actually I find it very interesting. It reminds me on the one hand of the Charles Moore House at Sea Ranch, which is and that's a kind of very, very intriguing connection on its own right. But for me, the kind of question of what that wood that you're actually talking about, what is actual, this is the craziest thing for me to say, but like what its actual structural limits and restrictions are, like quite literally, like the minute you introduce another material, the question of like how it then becomes kind of operated on and what its potentials are and what its potentials are to develop a language. I mean, for me, the part about the project where I would push the hardest on you guys is about language, about where is the language of form coming from in your work. Right now, it just seems like a kind of generic kind of stand-in, a kind of what was the word from chuggy? That was the word from this morning in the paper. A kind of chuggy kind of idea about form, you know, about the way a building, the way the material, the kind of lava, the way it's treated, the way it's kind of meant to mimic the kind of stone laying, and yet it's not, you know, it's not being done that way, and so forth. And I think that's really the area to branch forward. I mean, I think the question that you have to make a kind of decision about is, does the crisis that you're describing warrant a kind of reinvention of a language, or does the program that you're describing require the kind of maintenance of a language? I mean, and right now you're sort of stuck in between. I mean, the invention of a language is you only use invasives and trash to build the thing from. You only use problems to build the solution, right? And then the kind of maintenance of the traditional ones that you somehow transform the kind of traditional building materials in a way that allows you to kind of reconceive them. And you're sort of trapped in between right now. I don't think it's a problem. I think it's a question of where the project has ended in the semester rather than where the potential of the project really is. But that's where I would push really hard. Like, what can you get from, are you really going to use lava laid up that way, you know, with those shitty joints? Or are you really gonna dry stack it? Or are you gonna make it look like it's dry stacked and underneath there's some mysterious thing going on? Or are you gonna send all that stuff to a CNC, you know, send those boulders into CNC milling and reconceive a kind of local industry, or et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But that's really where for me the take is. I had a little bit of difficulty tracking through y'all's documents in terms of what the orientation of things was, if we were uphill or downhill and so forth. I just wanted to note that it was a little bit hard to follow in the presentation in terms of understanding the full site strategy. But I think that's less of where you guys are. I mean, I think there are other things about the site strategy. Like I kept looking for the freeway that in theory you see when the sun goes down. You know, like I know there's a freeway floating across the top of that valley, right? And you know, but there are other kinds of issues that I think will play out as we talk further.
Wow, that was interesting about the CNC. Let's see, all really good comments. What can I add here? I think overall it was a really good, really good project in terms of its development. You did a lot of work considering where it was at when we saw it at midterm. And I really do like the addition of the observational components and the sort of connection of your project to the site. I think I'm hesitating to say this, but I'm going to go ahead and say it in the spirit of your future advancement as architects, because if there is, you know, understanding the site and the sensitivity of the site, one thing that I really appreciate about the studio is that so far, every project that I've seen has really, gone to great extents to respect the site and to respect the culture of the site, and so that's really fantastic. But if we think about the site, if we think about architecture like a video game, and that there are certain like secret levels that you can unlock, I think that this project particularly, the Ohia was sort of could have unlocked the secret level, and maybe Amir, your agency as a native designer who's familiar with the landscape, you could have argued for an expansion of your project to consider in the way that the Ohia is very special, because the Ohia is very special because its evolution sort of tracks the landscape, and it for each elevation there's a special like variety of Ohia. At least in the diagram, you could have indicated how your site might require, like your plant is so, given the crisis of your plant, the crisis is so, how do you say it? So important that your architecture requires a concept that expands beyond your project. You start to get there with the observation. And so this is why I'm getting there, because you brought the observation in. So you're already extending beyond the site in terms of the observation. But I just wonder if there was a way for you to bring that expansion back down to the ground in a way that would have linked the mountain and ocean, because it's all there. I'm not saying any of this in a way to critique negatively the project. What I'm trying to say is that this project did such a good job at considering the plant in relation to the cosmos, that I think that aspect of the project just needed to be grounded in or could have been grounded in a larger way, which is sort of contrary to the site being limited to its boundary. Yeah.
Thank you.
Maybe
if you have any other, go ahead.
Yeah, so only just a micro comments on eventually some tips on that. Again, when we are talking about innovation, what kind of innovation? Are incremental or radical? Like what degree of novelty, you want to try to consider. I guess that eventually a zoom, in, for example, certain, like in this idea, construction techniques could have helped, try to rethink or imagining certain components in that, also to familiarizing it. Or again, if we are talking about observation, I guess the degree of performativity that observation might have can also start to trigger, like reflection on that. And maybe the fact that you were the lucky on-site person, like almost, like taking like those like prototype or type of timber that you are talking about, or like even forcing yourself in a certain degree of really personal observation, and maybe you have done, but like integrating it in the presentation, and almost relying on material that are not just drawings, sometimes, and tests that might not have a direct productive effect in that, could like start to give like additional input that relates to like a certain degree of empathy that might start to emerge with these plans. So I guess this is it's a comment on this note, and I guess again all these comments is that because everybody wants right now to see more.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
David, any other final comments or we move on?
No, it'll become clear as we go along. I keep looking at that drawing from mountain to ocean and how this the site makes a kind of strip that seems to lock off that whole valley. And I'm wondering if it actually feels that way when you're there. I mean, I realize you guys weren't there, but when you look at that three-dimensional drawings, that site as a kind of collar that crosses over and binds the two kind of corners of those two mountain ridges. I mean, it's not really what y'all's project's about. I'm just wondering, I'm just asking about it as a kind of perceptual thing. I mean, I guess, Sean, you know the site well. I mean,
Amir was there. Amir is the only one who was there because he's on Oahu.
It's insane making to look at that, like this also as this thing that holds, that literally the subdivision comes up to, and then it crosses and it restricts access to the valley in a way, I guess. Or are there subdivisions on both sides of it?
No.
Yeah, it would be a little bit, yeah. Basically, this is describing basically what a subdivision is. And yes, the mountain does like essentially collar this. And when you're within like this area of the site, that's pretty much what it feels like. Except you don't feel really closed off. I mean, the mountain is like enormous. So when you're directly on site, you're just kind of looking at ridge lines and certain peaks. But yeah, that it does have a feeling like you're describing.
But if you meant subdivision, David, by construction, right? The urban, there's only the subdivisions are only on the coastal side of it, not, yeah.
And Amir, I had another question for you, which is in Hawaii, are individual stones in lava, are they considered presentational? Like there's this, just reading this really interesting book called The Culture of Stone, a really fascinating book, and it talks about, kind of makes a kind of argument that it makes an argument about Inca architecture, but it makes a kind of broader argument for like Pacific Basin architecture, that stone acts, that one of the reasons there's so little ornamentation in Pacific cultural architecture is that stones are themselves presentational. That is to say, a stone represents the mountain that the stone came from, and it's in the mountain itself. And as a consequence, the value of much of that architecture is not visual. It's embedded in a whole series of other mechanisms. I wonder if you knew about that or not. Because if so, then there's more trouble with your project, or more to explore in terms of the kind of question of syntax, I think.
Yes, we did know that, but yeah, I mean, I'll just leave it at yes, we did know that.
Okay, sweet.
At a certain level, yeah.
I'll take it up with Amaya. Amaya's my TA. I'll take it up with her. We'll chat with it later on.
I'll just sort of add with the ornamentation. You know, there is ornamentation in wood carving, and ornamentation in lashing, and so just you know, in terms of representing the Pacific as a Pacific Islander, that's a good point about the stone, but that there were other ways that art and craft were sort of expressed. But who knows what would be possible now if you were to if CNC these stones. That's an interesting idea.
I've been told that I've been told it's actually quite difficult to CNC lava because it is. I mean, I'm really super interested in lava because I've been to a lot of places where, and you keep thinking, couldn't you just like literally cut a trench in a lava flow, an active lava flow, and literally like have it be a concrete pour that it's continuously pouring hot lava into formwork. And people convince me, like they're like, no, you cannot do that. I'm going, why can't you do that? I mean,
wow, David, I have a project for you. You have to go to Sicily because the lava is constantly flowing there,
and Stromboli and so forth, right? It's constantly a problem, exactly. and you're going, because it's such hard stone to work, right? And yet it's like you think about what's available, and like what's available that's mineral, right? As opposed, then to Alex, to your course description, what is there available that with which you can achieve mass aside from salt water, right? There's salt water and there's lava, and then beyond that, everything else is something you have to bring in or something you have to import.
Yeah.
So intriguing.
Great, thank you so much. I want to move on to the next projects, but I think you guys have a lot to think about, and you offered us a lot to think about. So thank you for that. I do believe that engaging more with the materiality and pushing that, as David was describing it, would be really a way to kind of add a critical component to your investigation. And the other aspect maybe to emphasize more is the issue of the care for the plants. I know it's there implicitly, but not yet that explicitly, the act of caring for the plants and how that is part really of the healing experience. To me, that would be really important to kind of express more in spaces like the outdoor spaces of all these micro activities that happen in order to actually be able to, to sustain these plants in their growth and support them. But thank you so much. Okay, we have Jasmine and thanks, and Michelle now.
Hi, good afternoon.
You're together. Wow.
We are together, yes.
Quickly, what's y'all's last name? So I want to pull up the PDF
Oh, I'm sorry.
separately.
It's
Perez and Kishinevsky.
Thank you.
Got it. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
And you see, David, that and the others, I actually put in the chat the links to the Mira boards if you want to see stuff together as well. It might be easier.
My name is Jasmine Perez.
And I'm Michelle Kishinevsky.
And our project is the EAEA Tea Brewery and Center for Rejuvenation.
For centuries, people around the world have testified to the relaxing and invigorating qualities of tea. The effect of tea on behavior is slightly paradoxical, as tea is both calming and relaxing at the same time. Yet the simple routine and ritual of brewing and drinking tea has been used at the end of the day by thousands of people as a mechanism for stress release and reflection. Abundant in Hawaii, the ia is a versatile plant that flourishes across the island of Oahu. The richness in the ia's natural properties allows it to be integrated into daily life in a variety of ways that are unique to the islands of Hawaii. Rich in nutrients, the stem, roots, and leaves of the ia were historically used as herbal supplements or medicinal herbs, taking the form of teas, juices, essential oils, and medicinal balms. To take advantage and embrace the rejuvenating capabilities of the ia, our design proposal integrates a tea garden and plant sanctuary that propagates and educates locals and visitors of the transformations of this endemic plant.
So to begin with, one of our maps from our previous investigation studies just overlaps different kinds of layers and characteristics that are specific to the ia. And through that, we were able to identify 2 main zones and 3 smaller zones based on where they are. And on the 3rd zone, you're able to see that is where our site is located on. And so with this in mind, we were able to then produce and then develop our site using ia and being able to integrate it throughout the entirety of our 3 different sections of our site.
This is an early botanical plate drawing that we did, really exploring the different textures and properties of the plant. And so you can see digitally modeled on the left, and then kind of in detail the different pieces of the plant and the stem and the bract and the leaves also in section.
And then here's more of an illustration of the different interactions it has with living organisms that are found throughout the site. On different parts of the plant, from the flower to the stems, and then the roots and the different kinds of soil it grows on.
So like we mentioned before, our overall idea with the design proposal is to create a space where tea brewing is at the core of our program. And so earlier in the process of learning about the ia, we learned about how the stem, leaves, and roots are harvested and then withered and pounded and then oxidized and rolled in order to brew tea. And one of the unique qualities of how tea used to be brewed in Hawaii was that they would actually use hot stones to brew the tea rather than the traditional way of brewing tea. So it was really interesting to start to learn about that. And it really informed a lot of the design strategies that we wanted to integrate later in our proposal.
And then here on the far left is a diagram of how the different parts of the EAA plant can be used to create different types of items, from lashings to cordage to juice and tea, just different types of things, and began to branch out what we then incorporate into the site. And then on the far right is an illustration of the process of the tea, of the EAA tea making. And then this page is just kind of showing different site imageries across the site. And one thing we really incorporated is that since there is, of course, a lot of bamboo on the site, that will be shown later on through our design proposal, how we begin to integrate existing materialities so that we could maintain as much of the site as possible and the integrity of the site as well.
Like Jasmine was just mentioning, as you could kind of see from the site photos, there is a lot of natural wood and bamboo on the site. And one thing that was really important to us was not taking away from that, but really maximizing the amount of natural landscape that we can maintain. And so this is just a precedent board that shows kind of the design qualities and the materiality and the aesthetic that we were going for in what we wanted the actual form of our building to do, as well as how we wanted it to interact with the mountains and the topography. And so I feel like the central picture is a really good example of different ways that curves and slopes can then begin to interact with the natural landscape. This is our overall site plan. One thing to note here, you can kind of start to see how we started to lay out the progression of our site, which we'll talk about a little bit more in detail. But the things that we wanted to highlight here were the river and the other natural properties that are happening on the site.
Here is just 4 different diagrams that then influenced our overall design of our proposal. And so on the far left is how we then began to organize our different spaces based on topographic relations. And so based on different programs, as we'll discuss later, whether it is grounded and built into the site, whether it's flat and that's where water collects. And so that's where we have a lot of our cisterns located at. And then also different varying heights, then it becomes more of a view as you go across the site. And on the second, dividing those massing formations based on our main processional path that runs through the site.
And then going off of that, like Jasmine said, in the second diagram, you start to see how we integrated the central axis that runs through the site. And then the next diagram next to it starts to go into the secondary and tertiary trails that then kind of broke off from it. And the very last diagram really exemplifies the built versus natural landscape that we chose to maintain. So like I said, there was so much bamboo on the site that we didn't want to take away from it. And we essentially integrated 3 different types of green space on the site. There's the natural landscape that we chose to maintain, the cultivation fields, and then man-made gardens that are integrated throughout the site. So this is a more zoomed in look at this progression that we're talking about. You can see that the main axis runs all the way from the beginning of the site all the way through. And the reason that we chose to maintain such a rigid line was because the topography lends itself to so many beautiful experiences and differences in elevation as you move through it. And you'll kind of see as we move through the project and talk about each specific section and why we divided it the way that it was, we felt as though having a central axis in which the user can experience the site actually lends itself to some very beautiful moments on the topography. So this is the breakdown of the 3 different portions of the site. And essentially, the EAEA has a lot of properties like Jasmine mentioned, and it's used for several different things. And the overall goal of our site was to create a space in which reflection, revival, and rejuvenation was highlighted. And so the first section of the site, as you enter the site, is more catered towards the education on the plant. There's a main building which houses the tea brewery and a tea garden where people can reflect and start to learn about the site. And then as you move a little bit further through the education section, you come upon these 3 workshops, each respectively going through a different property of the plant and how it can be used. So specifically how it's brewed into tea, how it's made into medicinal oils and herbs, and then how it's used for cordage. And there's an outdoor amphitheater that is surrounded there by the workshops, and can be used for educational purposes, but also for like workshop spaces. And then as you move through the site, you come into the cultivation section. Here, not only is there cultivation of the Iaia plant, but other native Hawaiian plants, and there's greenhouses in the administrative building. And then that brings you into the relaxation part of the site that promotes health and wellness, where we have spa spaces that actually integrate the medicinal herbs made on site, and then lodging for researchers and visitors of the site. And the progression between the three spaces, the way that we designed it was to start with a very public program and then move, as you move through the landscape, into a more private program.
Here's just a more zoomed in view of that education center and call outs of what the different experiences are within it. And so, as Michelle mentioned earlier, within this first program, we really wanted to be emphasized on the education of the plant and the different, 3 different workshops of it. And that's how we then began to integrate and introduce the plant to both the visitors and the locals of this proposal. And so here's a site section just heading through the main building. And so this is kind of our first interaction with the site on how we then begin to dig into the site and ground our building to create differing heights. So then we get this double height story that then feeds into the entrance of the site on the far right. And on the far left, how those workshops and the amphitheater begins to rise with the slope as well. And then here's another site section cut that goes in closer into one of those workshops and the amphitheater, and then begins to introduce the cultivation space and showing how these plants then begin to root itself into the site as well. And then
this is kind of showing that entry to the site. This covered walkway, it introduces you to the site from the main road and the parking. And like Jasmine was just talking about, as you move through on the left, you can see the main building and the double story and use of like glass and very thin mullions and operable walls, which allow for the integration and the juxtaposition between interior and exterior space. And then on the right, you can briefly see how those workshops start to frame the amphitheater. And then this is just a visual that shows kind of what's happening on the interior of this main building. Again, calling out the big like glass operable wall and the double story where people can kind of brew their own tea, and it feeds out into this large tea garden that then proceeds into the workshop spaces.
Here in the second center, the cultivation center, it's divided into 3 different cultivation plots that also correspond to 3 different greenhouses. And then this is like the first, we then begin to show the different call outs that happen and kind of the different experiences within this portion of the site. We also have the administration building as well, kind of beginning to then pull away from the public space and start to have that semi-public, semi-private transition throughout the site. And then so on this map, we then began to organize 3 different types of cultivation plots. And so one of them is based more on consumption of both the kalo and the uhi, and then more of like the medicinal and the herbal type of plants that we want to cultivate on the site, like the olona and the ulu and the uki. And then the third cultivation site in front of the greenhouses is just for the Iaia and the propagation of the Iaia.
And going off of that, just like the 3 workshops, each are an experience on the respective properties of the Iaia. The 3 greenhouses, each one is used to cultivate the different clusters and grouping of the other plants as well. And each one caters to a specific plot of the cultivation.
And then here's just a site section that then cuts through this greenhouse and throughout the cultivation site and kind of showing what is beyond the site as you then begin to transition through it. So we have the lodging shown in the back, the most private of the spaces as well.
And I think this section is a good example of, as obviously from plan, it looks as though our central axis is very rigid, but then here you can see how this path, as it starts to slope through different elevations, actually creates a lot of different experiences as you move through the site. And an elevation in the back is that most private lodging for visitors of the site.
And then here's the diagram of our water systems and how we then begin to choose to collect water. And so throughout the different groupings on the site, we have these connected pathways that then begin to filter water into different downspouts throughout the columns. And then the water collects in these different cisterns and then spits back out into different parts of the program. And so as you can see in the beginning portion with the education, it feeds back into the main building, the workshops. And in the second portion, the water that's collected from the greenhouses and the downward slope of the site where the administration building is then begins to feed back out into the 3 cultivation plots. And then also throughout the site, we have 2 different retention ponds at like the lowest heights of the site that then begin to also collect in cisterns that feed back into different parts of the project as well.
And just kind of pointing off of that, so each of the 3 sections has a grouping of program that's connected by a covered walkway. And it's actually these covered walkways that are sloped and they retain the water. And then that's brought back down through downspouts into the underground cisterns. So you can kind of see in the education, it's framed by the workshops. In the cultivation, it's by the greenhouses. And then in the health and wellness, it's by the spa spaces.
And then here's just another processional walkthrough of how you go through the site and then kind of the different elevational changes as you move along the main processional pathway. And then an up close, more of the greenhouse and how then there's different types of propagation and planting within these spaces that correspond to each. And just also showing how the bamboo then begins to both reveal and conceal parts of the site. And so from the main pathway in the previous, it seems very open, but then as you transition into different programs at the site, you then begin to be engulfed by the natural landscape.
So one thing that we didn't mention before when we were looking at the site plan, but I think is important to mention when we talk about this specific view, is when you first come into the site, we cleared away more of the natural landscape for that main area where the main building and the amphitheater are. And as you move to the more private program and closer into further into the site where the lodging is, that natural bamboo and landscape is maintained much more. And so it's almost as if we're cutting away from it. And that's helps and create this experience of moving from public to private program.
And then this is just the last portion, both the wellness center and the lodging, and then those also different calls, so it's happening. And so within this portion of the site, we then begin to integrate the 2 other properties of the EAE, both its medicinal uses and the way it's used in the cordage that you'll see later in one of our visuals. And then, so in this is just kind of a simple exploded axon of what one of these spaces is and the different materials that are used in it. And so we wanted to use bamboo recovered from the site to use as walkways and fenestration, and also begin to use grooved bamboo to then filter our water through our gutter systems. And then we also want to incorporate these different retractable curtain walls so that we can then adjust the amount of kind of the privacy and sunlight desired, and then also kind of that transitioning between the interior and exterior spaces, how much we want to reveal, how much we want to conceal as well.
And so obviously this is a diagram specifically for the spa space and the massage rooms, but the integration of these materials and the juxtaposition between bamboo and glass is a constant throughout the site.
And then here's just one of our visuals of this, the layout of these different buildings as they come together under these walkways, and then how it also is framed by the site as well. And then in this image kind of showing how then we would incorporate the cordage to then create this porous wall that then allows for natural ventilation to come through as well throughout the site. And that is it.
Thank you.
I'll put it on the site plan for now.
I'll do the zoomed in one.
Could I just ask a quick question? You mentioned the cisterns working along the walkways. Is it surface drainage mostly? So you're picking up surface drainage coming downhill by the walkway and then carrying that over?
It's a combination of surface drainage, but the covered paths. So I'm going to go to one of the views actually, so you can kind of see. Basically the idea too is that rainwater would be collected. Sorry, I keep skipping through these. Rainwater would also get collected through these, and then there's a glass cover over the bamboo on these covered pathways, and the roof sloped down to then also come into these like bamboo pillars that also a few of them have downspouts that go down into pipes that go into underground cisterns. So the covered pathways are supposed to act as rainwater like harvesting collection systems in combination with the roofing structures themselves.
So the sidewalk is just a kind of trench that's carrying water along, but it's actually not. It's not like a dam in the landscape. That's just a kind of technical question. And the other question was, did the two of you kind of calculate how much EA you have to kind of grow to make the whole kind of operation work?
We didn't. We did not. I mean, we talked about it, but also EA is like very powerful across the like Hawaii in general. It's one of the plants that grows pretty much everywhere. I don't know if you like Jasmine called it out when we talked about the map, but we didn't do an actual calculation to see exactly how much we would need. But the idea was that it would be used mainly, but in combination with other wood as well on the site.
It's not used as a main structural type system, but kind of throughout the site it changes. And so like the property that we're focusing on, so in the beginning, the tea brewing, and the second part, the cultivation of it, and the third part, how we then begin to use medicinal, and then also the cordage properties to then start to build our different proposal and design different parts of the buildings.
I was strictly asking about the amount of tea that like the tea that you want to produce, that quite literally as an agricultural crop, how much do you need to put into production? That was it actually, I don't know, strikes me as more important than just throwing away off the side, but we'll come back to it.
Well, also just
Great question.
There's other plants that are integrated into the like cultivation spaces that we included that are also used for tea brewing. So that
it has zero to do with that. It has to do with the question of seeing the productive landscape or not, and if that's important or not. And I mean, we'll come back to it. And I'm sure there may be other questions. It doesn't have to do. It has to do with the actual amount and how you would limited it or delimited it in the site, and which I find a very interesting kind of a problem. So, but let's make sure there's no other questions. Yeah, there may not be any other questions. I mean, then I might as well just leave it a little bit further. If Alicia and Sean, if you don't mind, so for me, this is kind of the strange thing about the project. I like, there's many things about the project and that y'all have done that are beautiful, and the time and labor you put into some of the renderings, just to really. Actually, I feel like I'm in Hawaii. It's quite nice, and it's very, very, very beautiful and very kind of pleasing. For me, the issue has to do with, like, when you're given an assignment like this, the chance to step away from it and look at how the assignment might have come to be, right? So we can talk about the assignment realistically in studio now because of the kind of rise of experience economies around the world, right? So the idea that you might, that 500 years ago or 200 years ago, this plantation would all be about quite literally what's the absolute number of, bushels of tea we can make, what's the labor costs, where's the labor coming from, who are they, is there a hierarchy of the overseer versus the laborer, all that stuff. And 100 years later, we can talk about a tea plantation only because it's a kind of thing where people might go to heal themselves, which is interesting, right? So it doesn't mean that the question then becomes, well, what's the relationship of the activity to the land and to the specific crop, and especially with regard to the amount, right? I mean, like it seems to me that amount, that just saying, well, it's growing all over the island. I mean, there used to be whales growing all over the Pacific, right? And then they all got hunted out because because they just, the same idea applies, it seems to me. The kind of question about the question about whether, I mean, I'll tell you about your project. I like somewhat the most, although I wish it were kind of harder. I actually like the idea of a ruthless central axis. That actually kind of marks the idea that I wish that, I hate to say this because now we're talking about speculation and things but my immediate thought was I wish it floated above the whole landscape. That the axis was the thing that you could walk along to where you could oversee the whole event of the experience. Because I mean, to me, like if you think about Hawaii, and if you haven't been, it's very weird because the land has been parceled up and you drive along the kind of one road around the loop and you pass from one experience to another, right? One hotel or a thing or yet another thing. And each one is an interpretation of the place. They're not all, it's not all that way, but many of them are. And many of the things that you see are a chance to pull off into yet another interpretation of what Hawaii might be, is, was, could be, and so forth. And so for me, where the project, it's not really a criticism, because in all fairness, you'd have to have gone there to begin to get a clearer sense of this. But in many ways, your project is in competition with other interpretations of explaining the landscape. And so then it seems to me you have to be very careful to give the visitor a very broad range of informations, both ones that are curated, like the ones that you're doing. You're curating a series of experiences, you're curating a series of gardens, you see them, but also a chance to kind of step back and be able to put that curated experience into a larger, more personal, less curated frame of reference. And that for me would involve or entail actually being able to see the agricultural operation as an operation, which is about producing food, not about healing me in a way. I don't know if that makes sense as criticism, but that's my first reaction. I have other kind of thoughts.
No, I understand that. We could have pushed further and kind of then I can't think of the word, like you said, mention like how much is needed, how much we need on the site, and kind of influencing our design based on that as well, as opposed to just only different experiences, but like how much do we need to cultivate and grow on site for the juicery and the tea?
Well, it's a really difficult, it's a difficult kind of problem. The problem is one of like, do you go to a kind of operating farmscape numbers-based, organization of the fields in such a way, or the plantings in such a way that you can get work, infrastructure, water, all those things to it most readily, and then you build your other system around it? Or do you simply apply it as a kind of absolute system over the landscape, and then let your system of inhabitation reconnect that absolute system of agriculture to the kind of condition of topography and so forth? There's a lot of variables. It's a problem that y'all didn't address. And if you were going to address it, it would lead you into some different areas of thought. I'm not really complaining about it, but I sort of am. It's sort of like a kind of thing where you want, because right now you come there and the overall, I think that the sense of the geometries is that you walk away slightly perplexed about like what in the sequence of geometries allows me to ground this experience against all the other uncertain experiences I have on the island. That's why that's why I mean it's an unfair criticism. You have to have gone there to get a better sense of that weirdness. I think that's there.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I think we went back and forth a lot when we were working with the site on like having the rigid access and how we were going to make it work, and the way that we organized program and landscape around it. And I feel like it was still a work in progress when we, like, it still is.
Right.
Yeah. And I can't speak for Jasmine, but
no, we had those options of debating between a meandering path or whether a strong processional access. And we chose that the main straight line rigid access would then allow those different views as you go along and keep throughout one direction throughout the site. But also would have pushed that thinking about how would we have then incorporated the amount of cultivation we need to produce a tea that could have influenced maybe that processional access as well.
I think it was also a little bit that like we wanted to try to maintain as much of the natural landscape there and like not cut away from it too much. So it was just like trying to find a balance between all of those things that we maybe didn't explore it as much as we should have.
Yes, it's this giant nightmare, since that landscape of that overgrown bamboo is arguably a second or a third nature already that's there, and so you have, again, now you're getting into these deeply muddy syntactical areas where you're like, like words like the natural landscape that's there, you're going, which natural landscape that's there? Yeah. But let's set this issue aside. I don't want to hog this conversation.
Yeah, maybe I am connecting. Thanks a lot for your presentation. And again, a very interesting project. It's sparking a lot of interesting reflection on approaches. I guess that connecting back on, maybe, point that that you could have, embraced. I mean, obviously, right now, looking at the project and almost brainstorming on top of it. I guess that an interesting reflection is also maybe related to, again, the specificity of the plants in relation to the processes that you were highlighting at the beginning. That could, in a certain way, support a questioning on, for example, the role of this, education aspect. Imagining, for example, right now in my comment that maybe the cultivation aspect was not like the main scope, or its scope more like for, let's say, more ludic roles, meaning to support in a certain way a micro production that goes in the other two like programmatic output of the project. But I think in this, you can really, engage again from the small scale of the activity, and asking how eventually certain steps, certain procedures could inform space. And I'm wondering if, this act of making tea related to a number of people in particular, it's more an individual, it's more in group, how many groups, or, what is the time spent of, I'm going there, I'm engaging it, and I am finishing within one day, or I'm coming back the following day. And because there could be elements and detail that, can start to, for example, enrich the space, depending on, again, like the occupation that you imagine that would be. I'm saying it because I'm maybe trying to read a bit of traces of occupation within the visualization that you have doing. And again, probably is there, it's just to activate it, in relation to the specificity that you've started to present at the beginning of your research. I'm also intrigued by the ruthless, how David was mentioning it, like straight axis. It seems at the beginning almost like an Italian garden, like that has this like a very, very constructed axis. And I mean, that's why I was also wondering if it has an infrastructural value somehow in relationship to like all the water reflection at the beginning, or, if it's really this like almost, like, as you say, like a path, that cut through, again, how it could eventually, like really be a medium of curated different experience of the landscape, and how, like, again, maybe it's really, like curating natural experience, even in certain forms, and highlight a little bit different specific qualities, in a certain rhythm. Yeah, I mean, but again, maybe going back to the processes, I think that this engagement with the plants, there was a moment in which, if I remember well, you were also talking about weaving, about these different sort of like details / skills that were related to process of working on the plants, could, eventually also find their own way in the material exploration that then you have produced, more than maybe arriving later as a material that it's deployed, but entering in a more specific way in which you are positioning it. So maybe just consider it as a general comment on that. But yeah, I mean, there are a lot of interesting aspects that obviously is very worth discussing here.
Thank you.
Thank you. I think that there's something really interesting that emerges from this conversation is the difficulty for an architect to actually consider something else than architecture as a driving force in a project. And what David was saying before, you could have started really thinking as like a farmer, and then allow the farming strategy to drive your way of thinking about the site organization, to then only weave the architecture into that. But that would be one strategy. You, of course, adopted a different strategy in which it's more like what Alicia is saying, that the cultivations become this kind of micro, almost like tastes of what it would be like. That becomes something you see very often initially on farms, where it's more educational than really farming, and that the real farming happens somewhere else. But I think it's a very important issue, and I wish we were working like in teams with landscape architects. It would have probably changed this attitude, it would have been a really great studio for, for interdisciplinary work. But it could also have to do with the way it's structured, because, I never said think like a farmer, and I should have said at some point think like a farmer. We went from thinking like a botanist, an ethnobotanist, to thinking like an architect, and I think that we see the effects of that. So it also kind of tells you a lot about how structuring your own process influences very much the outcomes, right? And of course, here I was the one to structure it, but I think this is a super interesting issue to take on, like allowing the landscape and the plants themselves to take over, and then really think about architecture as something just kind of comes in as a second violin rather than the first one, right? Okay, I'd like to jump into the last project to give Nicole plenty of time to present and have a conversation. Thank you, Jasmine and Michelle. Thanks.
Thank you so much.
So just a comment for you to understand, Nicole, Jasmine, and Michelle actually worked together on the initial research, but then they decided to split and work on the project separately. So you will see some of the drawings that might look similar. That's because they work together. Go ahead, Nicole.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm Nicole. Let me share my screen. Okay. All right, so I'm going to start just by reading the introduction to the narrative for my project. Let's see. This place is a bit surreal. Everything seems more vibrant here, more alive. The greens are greener, the smells more fragrant, the sounds more crisp, and the tastes, our ultimate destination. The tastes are more intense. There even seem to be more bugs and animals around. The soil is so active it almost moves. The ecosystem cycles that we all learn about in grade school are on display here in real time. Wander even just a few yards into this place and you feel like you're lost in a far-off jungle. So you can see here, again, I also studied that EAEA plant. And this is a woody climbing vine. It's a liana, and it's found in the understory of the island's forests. It's pretty common and it's quite beautiful. You can see here in the center of this screen, this incredibly colorful, large bract that produces and houses the flowers and the fruit of the plant. So I looked at that a lot, but I looked at a lot, as you can see here, but there were really three things that stood out to me and that I kind of carried with me through the design process. One being the color, the pigment. I was really attracted to, especially these really bright kind of fuchsia corally colors of the flower and of the fruit. And you'll see that kind of pop back up into my design moving forward. Two, I was really drawn to the climbing nature of this plant. One thing that's really interesting and unique about lianas is that they don't produce any of their own internal structural organs. They rely completely on other plants for structure and support for holding them up. Instead, they're able to dedicate all of their energy towards just growing very long. So they're these very fast growing plants, but the fact that they need a partner, they need a support system was really intriguing to me. And then three, their rapid growth and mobile nature means that they play a really important role in maintaining soil health. And soil is of particular interest to me because of how vital it is, not only to plant life, but to human life as well. I really believe that we are connected to soil through our own internal microbiomes. And so healthy soil really means a healthy life and a healthy body. So the EAEA plays a really vital role in nutrient distribution through the forest floor. So as it's kind of moving around looking for sunlight, it's dropping its leaves, and these leaves are rich with nutrients, which is just adding to the organic matter and the health of the soil. So these three things really inspired much of my design. And then my program, my actual concept was actually inspired by a fourth quality, which we just learned about of the EAEA, which is the fact that it's edible. And so many parts of the plant can be used in tea, but I was also inspired by a handful of the other plants that we looked at in studio that are also edible. And you can see those listed here. So another tea plant and then 2 tubers. So it's this relationship between humans and plants, this relationship that we have with the soil and the cycle of life that we're a part of, specifically in regard to nourishment and health, that really sets the stage for the program. And that is a chef's table kitchen concept and a cultivation center that really takes you on this journey from plant to plate. And so this menu you can see over here will serve as sort of a map through this journey. And we'll see that a little bit later on. So the site itself, as we've seen, it's located on the east side of the island, sort of nestled within the arms of this volcanic range. So again, here you get a better view of that valley location. And then, you know, as you can see the site, we have this kind of incredible variation of small peaks and valleys. And then of course, just the density of the vegetation on site. So cutting through in section, you can start to see how the land falls. And some of these snapshots at the bottom of this page give you some context onto the site and specifically the vegetation. As others have done, I'm also proposing using bamboo as part of the construction. So in terms of primary structural considerations, I really focused on the need for lateral stability, a structure that could hold up under possible seismic activity, possible wind activity. And then of course, water is a really important component, not only a structure that can shed water, given the amount of rain that the area receives, but also, you know, a site that, a structure that can kind of stay out of the way of some of the water runoff that'll be coming from that mountain range. And then in terms of design, I was really focused on tropical architecture and tropical construction, looking at, you know, what are those issues? Passive cooling, passive ventilation, maintaining a kind of minimal footprint, being kind of light on its feet. And then going back to the EAEA and its climbing nature, you know, I was really interested in creating a structure that could serve as a trellis, something that could host both human life, but also plant life. So you can see here, the site being so long and narrow really lends well to this idea of procession, this idea of journey. And we'll dive into this site plan in more detail, so don't squint too hard here, but you can begin to see here the layout of some of the major components and how they start to inform your journey through the site. And so before you get to the plate, the kitchen, you make this trek through soil and sunlight and water and root and leaf, and maybe even chickens, getting glimpses all along the way into the process from plant to plate. And for those that want more of an immersive experience, there's an ecotourism component to this concept with the inclusion of lodging units down here on the southern side. So all of these major parts get stitched together by this path that I imagine being of this graded metal that's just slightly hovering above the soil to continue to allow the soil to breathe while still maintaining some sort of connection between us and the earth. So then if you bring back the menu into this plan, you can see here how it starts to become a map showing you where what you're eating is coming from. So before we start our trek through the site, I just want to introduce the architectural language. And so given the earlier site considerations and design considerations, namely that need for stability, elevated construction, something that's light on its feet, and something that can shade well and shed well, I landed on this system of trusses. So with bamboo used as the frame, we have this variety of cladding options within the webs, like bamboo screening, for instance, or a kind of wattle and daub technique wherever solid walls are needed. And notice here some of that pigment starting to show back up in design. So then the majority of the structures that you'll see kind of follow this 8x8 grid, where you have the truss here on the short end and then the X bracing in the lateral direction. So then the interior spaces, as you can see down here, kind of start to inhabit the webs of this frame. And you can see up here in the diagram kind of how this system starts to address some of those concerns. And then, where you start to introduce the floor plate, that can be adjusted as needed to help navigate the topography. So then here again, inserting some of those interior volumes up into the frame, which then allows the extremities of the truss to be used as a trellis for the plant. So we'll start at the entrance as we begin our little journey. I use these early sketches to try and convey the feeling of what it might be like to wander through here. So the goal of this path that goes throughout the entire site with all of its kind of angles, it does follow the topography, but its aim is to try and disconnect you from relying on your dominant sense, which for most of us is our vision, and really instead heighten your other senses. And so you might not always be able to see exactly where you're going, but maybe you can hear where you're going. Maybe you hear, water falling into this detention pond. Maybe you hear chickens kind of leading you along. And so, you start to kind of become more aware of the environment through your other senses. And then eventually these forms start to kind of peek their way through the foliage. And then it's this next stage, the grow stage, where the forms start to become a little bit more significant. And so this is the grow house, the greenhouse, for anything that needs a little bit more care and attention. And you can see it's oriented north-south. So this, bottom portion would be the sun house. The side oriented to the north would be the shade house, and then it's anchored by a little shed. So these diagrams just give you kind of a quick idea of what that truss profile will look like for this structure. And I will zoom in really quick. And then you can see in elevation, you can just start to get a sense of what's open and what's closed. So this would be that sun house. This would be the shed, and then behind it would be the shade house. In the other direction, you start to see this X bracing in action. So the shed here, the shade house over here, and then the sun house behind it. So then this is kind of how it would start to situate itself into the land. Obviously, there would be tons of plants, so you wouldn't exactly be able to see like this. But this gives a good idea of, this system and how it starts to kind of anchor itself into the land while also hovering these spaces above it. So if you remember that volcanic range, the arms of it kind of embrace the site in this way. And so we do get a peek at some of the slopes. So this view would be taken standing right here looking this way. So you do get a little glimpse at this structure, which is a view, just a kind of typical simple viewing deck sort of platform. And then the actual greenhouse space right here. So you can begin to see the shed, and then that sunroom, and then the shade house in the back. So then in plan, again, we'd be approaching from this way, which would be coming from that viewing deck through some garden beds, following the path, the ramp up into the space with the shade house, the sun house, and the shed, which then leads you on to the kitchen. But if we cut through the short section, you can get an idea then what that space starts to look like within the site. And so let me zoom in. So again, here, that sunroom, and I imagine this being the room that's used to dry the tea leaves, a shade house in the back, starting to show you what that bamboo screened wall might look like and feel like, a cut through section of the shed, and then following that ramp down through the garden beds. And you can also see over here to the right, just a little bit of an idea of what some of these retaining walls start to look like as they kind of carve their way through the topography. So then moving on to the next part, which is the kitchen. this is located kind of in the midpoint of the site. And I will point out just a couple of things here. It's anchored with this area right here, which is actually an imu, which is an in-ground oven, traditional Hawaiian in-ground oven, anchoring it to the grow houses, to the kitchen. And I really imagine this space just being a really fun little nook in the site for alfresco dining, for dining out under the stars, and just a really sweet spot for community, for fellowship, for cooking. And so you have, I will also say that the kitchen space, this left-hand side is an upper level, which you can access from the upper end of the site, and then the lower level, which is accessed across this bridge, which connects it to the viewing platform. And so we'll get into site plan, but again, over here on the right, you can see the basic truss profile, a typical kind of clear story truss. The west elevation, so this would be entering from that upper level of the site. You can see kind of what's open, what's closed, the veranda space. In the back, you can start to see the lower level atrium kind of peeking up over that truss. And then this would be the long elevation on the north side. And so you can see down here, this is that lower level with that big atrium space, and then the upper level and how those two start to connect. So then, in terms of how it starts to place itself in the site, we would be standing right here, looking this way. And so you can see that bridge starting to connect from the viewing deck to the kitchen. Again, you have the upper level up here, and then just a peek of the atrium space in the back. So then in plan, this is how the two start to kind of engage with one another in this L shape. So we'll start over here, walking along the path from the emu up into this terraced veranda area. And you have your office space, a guest kitchen for anybody who's staying more long-term, and then the teaching kitchen, which again, will serve anybody who's staying more long-term for that more immersive culinary experience. I imagine this wall, we'll see this more in section, but I imagine this wall being, a planted wall, bringing the soil up into this space and providing a space for, herbs or whatever. And then if we go down to the lower level, you would be from this side entering from that bridge. And this is the fun space. This is the chef's table. This is kind of where all the action happens. And so here you're within this big kind of grand gallery area that I just imagine, being filled with all the activity. And I will note that the teaching kitchen overlooks the chef's table. There's a glazing wall right here. So gives sort of a connection between the two. And then everything that's a little bit less glamorous is maintained back here in this kind of back of house area. So we'll take our first section through the upper level. We're going to cut through the veranda and then jog down and cut through the teaching kitchen. So you can see here again how that structure starts to root itself into the ground while also, suspending us up within the air. And zooming in here, just a note of this planted wall. I really love this because even though at this height and up in these spaces, we're sort of disconnected from the soil, this wall serves to kind of bring that soil back up into this space and maintain that connection and give it honor. And so this, again, looking through the teaching kitchen, that glazed wall in the back that allows you to maintain that connection with the professional kitchen. The idea there being, while I'm learning how to cook my fish, I can be glancing over and watching the professionals do it down below. And you can also start to see some of the beams from that really kind of grand atrium space in the back. And so cutting now through a long section, we're going to go through the upper level and then we'll cut right through the chef's table. And we're going to go even a little bit longer and jog up through that emu area. I'm really quickly going to switch to a double screen view. And so you can see here that really long section what that begins to look like. So we have the grow house over here, the viewing platform off in the distance, and then the kitchen space. So we'll start over here in the kitchen. And so here you can really start to get a sense of kind of the vibrancy and the activity of this space, this big kind of grand atrium that I imagine just being filled with sunlight and smells and sounds and noises and all the fun and joy of cooking. And then you can see here this teaching kitchen and how it overlooks the professional kitchen, maintaining that important relationship. Moving over, we have the guest kitchen. You can also see here an idea of what that screened wall starts to look like, an office space, and then the veranda in the back, which you can see just kind of the wild quality and nature of the plants, but I imagine just starting to really take over this trellis. And as we continue onward, so here you can see that emu area, that little kind of nook in the site where you're kind of carving into the soil, where the oven is carved into the earth. And so I don't know, I imagine this a really beautiful little space to have outdoor dinners, throw up a few string lights maybe in the trees. And then I also really love the view you get here of the grow house. I think you can start to see how that X bracing starts to take on this sort of lattice quality. So then moving on now to the final stop in our journey, this is the lodging units. So you can see they occupy sort of that steeper hillside on the southern end of the site. And you can also see that they're all oriented east. And that was done intentionally to open them up to the sunrise. This view of them kind of clinging to the hill would be taken from right about here. And again, you can see kind of one of the arms of that mountain range behind them. So in plan, this is kind of what I imagine, just very simple, basic kind of micro units, but opening up to that sunrise. There are studies recently that have shown that early sunlight is the healthiest sunlight that you can get on your skin. And so waking up to that sunrise is very important to me. And then maintaining some sort of, operable screening system that allows for, that cross ventilation and passive cooling. Maybe some sort of operable glazing system on the east side as well. So then in elevations, you can see on the south side, it would be mainly solid walls. On the north side, again, being mainly screened walls. And so then in section, if we're cutting through, this is looking south at sunrise, you can start to see how this truss system really begins to root itself and anchor itself into the ground. And I love this because it kind of provides a whole new perspective of the site where you're sort of suspended up within the tree canopy. This cut is through what would be the steepest incline of one of these units. So all the others would be slightly less steep than this, but gives kind of a good depiction of what that space would be like. So I will just conclude by finishing up the narrative that I started. So this place is a bit surreal. Everything seems more vibrant here, more alive. The greens are greener, the smells more fragrant, the sounds more crisp, and the tastes, our ultimate destination. The tastes are more intense. There even seem to be more bugs and animals around. The soil is so active, it almost moves. Those ecosystem cycles that we all learn about in grade school are on display here in real time. Wander even just a few yards into this place, and you feel like you're lost in a far-off jungle. Following the path, we hover above the soil. Its graded and patinated metal allows the soil breath, light, and water. At times, it carves through the topography, and where it disappears for a moment, either into the earth or overtaken by foliage, earthen walls tinted in pink usher us onward. Eventually, you begin to notice the peaks breaking through the forest canopy, strong angular forms in such stark contrast to the softness of Mother Nature, and yet sometimes it's hard to tell what's building and what's plant. One becomes the other, intertwined in a mutual support system. Cutting in and out of structure, nature, you can't help but notice the intricacy, delicacy, and strength of the bamboo frame. Rooted firmly into the soil, this frame suspends spaces midair in a comfortable tension. As it shades the sun and sheds the rain, you can't help but feel both protected from and yet fully within creation. The final stop, Chef's Table, where the entirety of this journey is summarized on the dinner plate. It is here you are finally able to taste what you could see and hear and touch and smell and feel and know. From soil to water, to root, to seed, to fungi, to leaf, to sunlight, to fruit, it all exists on the plate. To know the earth is to taste the earth. And yet this is not the end, but just the beginning of another cycle. Thank you.
Thank you, Nicole.
Alicia, I should let you go first because last time I just talked and talked and talked and talked. Although I do have a question. Can I ask one question before I let you go, Alicia? So, Nicole, do you want EAEA a little on that buildings or a lot?
What was that?
The vine that's growing, the EAEA vine growing on the buildings, do you want a little bit of it growing on there or a lot of it growing on there?
It could be either or.
No, it cannot be either or. Which one do you want, a little or a lot?
I mean, I represented it as a little.
Yeah, that's why I'm wondering. So it's not what you wanted, it was just a little.
Yeah, a little of everything, I guess, is what I would say.
Okay. And doesn't that EAE, does it have to grow in the shade?
It does. It grows kind of in the.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Sweet. All right. Alicia, sorry, I'm done.
But go, David.
Where? Well, I was just thinking.
Anywhere.
I was just thinking about this, like, so I love your project. I love the representation, and I want to say that, and this is true for, like, I mean, this has been such a weird semester. You know, everything's gotten thrown apart, and all the projects, when you're looking at them on these final reviews, you're really talking about projects in process. And so I think that for me, the kind of best advice is advice about how to develop the project further, right? Like if I'm looking at it, which way to go, like not less criticism, but looking at all of its weaknesses, right? And so instead of that kind of end of the semester, congratulations, you know, this is, for me, this is kind of like a still in process review. And so it being more precise about things that are unclear. And for me, the thing that's most unclear is this question about the experience that you want to have. And you described this kind of haptic experience that was based on sound, which I think is problematic because the highway is moving through there and you hear the highway. But really about this kind of place where you lose, because of the geometry, which I like very much, the idea of the geometry of this vine, which is essentially an ambitious pioneer that finds its own strange geometry. That you really are imagining a kind of place where the experience is predicated on some visual sequence so much as a kind of sequence of kinds of discoveries where things are obscured. And then, to me, the idea that the building is a trellis makes a whole lot of sense. Although that's the kind of point where I go, yeah, now, Nicole, I have a bunch of questions, right? Why isn't it a double layer of trellis? Why isn't there a layer that hides, that makes shade for the vine to come up so that that kind of notion of hiding or obscuring becomes more important, and the idea of action below the, so that was the kind of first comment I was going to just generally conceptually, the kind of way that you're thinking about the structures is more of them all of a sudden as kind of primary structural expressions, as opposed to sticking with, wait, what's the primary structural expression have to support? It has to support an experience that you already have in mind. And that, to me, that experience is layered, but you've kind of stripped a layer off of it. And I would go towards like really growing, as either growing as much on there as possible, or alternatively going to a system of bamboo roofing, which would require you to reconceive the roofing in a kind of fundamentally different way, but then would allow you to begin to develop the sections of the buildings as being quite surprising, as opposed to being mere expressions of the external experience, that when you come upon them and then you move within them, it's a little bit like moving into a bamboo grove. You suddenly discover something that's not predictable and so forth. So that's the kind of like, for me, like looking at these drawings going, there's a layer missing here. Like you begin to hint at it with these kinds of like memory, like kind of spaces of memory kind of somehow found within these kind of larger frameworks. But for me, like I would want so much more of this plant to be doing the hard work of setting up your expectations. Even the idea of like like one of those kudzu landscapes where you come and everything's overgrown, and then you move below it and beneath it and you begin to discover things. Even like you were showing, the kind of vegetable gardens, I would actually, and it's kind of very politely kind of cleaned up around them so you can access all four sides of the wheelbarrow. I'd be like carving those things weirdly into the bamboo, you know, in the strangest, oddest ways. So that's kind of my first kind of take is that there's a beautiful presentation, beautifully drawn, actually beautifully conceived, but the linkage between the experiential frame and the structural frame is, for me, missing a layer of space making, actually, and engagement with the EAEA plan. I love the menu, by the way.
To me, I mean, I will start to congratulate with your project and presentation. I mean, I think that was very thoughtful in so many aspects, and you know, so many details. No, so I've really enjoyed it. And again, I mean, I guess not just the drawing aspect of it, also the presentation, the text that you have written. You know, there was a lot of reflections on so many levels. I think that your project has a lot of qualities. I guess personally, really, maybe I found extremely interesting this idea of trying not to impose like a very strong geometry on the landscape, but having a specific negotiation or adaptation. I mean, that eventually could be push a bit even further, no? But I guess, you know, in comparison, for example, to other cases, there is a clearly different approach to that, no? I also, I think, find quite intriguing that sometimes your structure have spaces that don't seems, are not habitable almost, no? They don't seem to be like measured on human terms, no? And they are giving me an intriguing idea again, no? Of where they for, no? And how am I experiencing, like those cut out tiny, you know, corners that start to emerge under, no, those trellis. Yes, and again, the depiction of, I guess, or trying to engage in essential manners, obviously, you know, from a distant placement, you have not been able to visit the landscape. So I'm imagining that obviously a little bit of speculation, no, in trying as much as you can to understand the complexity of that, but also understanding again that maybe those experiences are also fine if they're not totally pristine, you know? We have mentioned a few times that it's still a very much a constructed nature and is an environment that I guess has a certain degree of disturbances, no? And maybe that is also an aspect that could make this entire process quite interesting. Maybe let's say one point again, no, that as we are here, I think as David was mentioning, almost also looking and having a final reflection on your project or eventual aspect that that seems that have, you know, a lot of potential and could be looked forward. Maybe my comment are on experiential level, but on a slightly other sense. Everything seems very specific and very particular, but maybe when you arrive on the kitchen, being very cool, the settings still feel a little bit international in the kitchen table form of, you know, organizing the space. I guess it's really a question of time because we have covered many things, no? But probably engaging with the act of cooking, the menus, no, that are almost proposed could almost start to, you know, like bring idea of, again, you know, like different strategies of cooking that might start to, you know, identify a specific, you know, like setting and choreograph of spacing in itself. And I guess the process of foraging, you know, I'm not exactly understood how it's happening, if it's happening, and how it can be related to that experience. And again, you know, like maybe this just like tiny little, I don't know how I can say, no, but I especially I guess in the dorms part, no, I guess that the geometry could be a little bit more adaptive. there is a little bit of repetition of dimensions, of setting in between spaces, and I'm imagining that if there are real, trees there would be a slightly misalignment, eventually from, like the perfect placement, but these are really details, and I think that I really want you to congratulate, to all of the considerations that you have put, and it was, very, very, very charming.
Yeah. I agree with the points that have just been made. I do want to say that if this landed in my lap and I were going to ask to move it forward, I would start with the walkway. Like, you mentioned this kind of very beautiful idea that the whole system of motion to the landscape that you're describing, and that Alicia was just talking about, the huge advantage of it experientially, setting up this experiential frame, begins with the kind of idea that the walkway itself mimics the way that the vine kind of pioneers its way through the landscape. It's a great actual design detail problem. Like, how do you detail, how do you write a rule for the framework that's trabeated, just carrying something over the landscape in a system of columns, to allow it to do things like a handrail and to allow it to make random odd changes of angle? How do you actually used to give that problem in Vertical Studio? It's the first problem for students to do. Like, how do you make a walkway that has to have this rule that it allows for odd angled changes, and then it makes them? There are not many examples of projects like that. There's a beautiful project by Anderson Museum of the Cascades, where they made a series of tunnels into, they were trying to make a museum in a redwood forest that had been cut down, and they wanted to write a rule for what do you do when you run into roots? And so they wrote a rule, and then they would let the geometry generate itself. But the idea, you can imagine how difficult it would be to do in bamboo, right? Just how difficult it would be to detail it all. It's the kind of thing that for crying out loud, there are generations of Japanese bamboo cutters who've just figured out garden staves, right? But it seems to me that beginning to think that way would then also begin to carry over into the detailing of the larger building. Like, for me right now, the larger buildings aren't really detailed in bamboo. They're really detailed in wood, right? They're detailed in wood with X-bracing and cable, right? The X-bracing is not, traditionally X-bracing in that particular landscape is done with shear boards, not with cross bracing, and it's a fundamentally different kind of conception. Actually, I wrote down the name of there's this place quite beautiful, Monte Vista Lodge in Mindo, Ecuador, which is made of bamboo, where all the shear is handled but primarily by boards, right? In when you need rectilinear spaces, right? Like traditional Japanese architecture, right? You have to have a rectilinear space, which you keep drawing in the sections. The sections are always rectangular or square spaces. Square grid is what you ultimately get. But getting the square grid requires that you put bamboo in tension, right? Which is this kind of strange, weird problem that is particularly hard with bamboo, because it's a material that often needs to be replaced, or actually has to have built into the way you conceptualize it some idea of replacement. So that's why going all the way back to kind of thinking about how you might begin to develop the parts and pieces of a system for a handrail that allowed you to make multiple angle decisions might also lead to the basis of a kind of more interesting, I think, language. Here you look at VTN, right? VTN's over there. They're trying to figure out this question of language and bamboo, right? And they're going in one direction, right? And they're going towards a kind of expressiveness built on kind of massive multiplicity. And I don't think that's what your problem is. But I also don't think the problem of your project is this kind of neutrality where you then begin to fill things, you begin to resolve with infill that isn't, for me, the drawing that's missing here is the first layer of infill has to be the EA between your bamboo column and anything else you begin to conceive of. But then also, it seems to me the whole question of what the geometry has to accomplish is more interesting. The one thing that we haven't talked about, or you didn't talk about really, is what the roofs are made of, and why the roofs aren't made of bamboo. It's because you want to avoid that particular problem, right? That's a whole other kind of dimensional dilemma about language and syntax and so forth that comes in. But that would be the other thing, I think, that the other direction to kind of resolve it. So you've said, I'm going to start with the detail of a handrail, and I'm going to start with a decision about a roof. I'm going to work back from both ends to arrive at actually what I need to accomplish with this bamboo frame. I think that's how you might develop it towards a level of criticality that would then commend all the other thought that you put into your project, which I think is a beautiful project.
Yeah, that's super helpful. I think, early on, I really struggled with the idea of bamboo, and it's like, I really want this whole thing to be bamboo, but, we're still, as a world, we're still exploring, how do we join these things? What does a hybrid model with bamboo and metal and maybe concrete look like? How can we maintain bamboo throughout its life cycle? How can we take into consideration that breakdown, that natural breakdown? But
the really good thing about the fact that we don't know that means that you as a student can leap into it with actual suggestions rather than avoidances. You know what I'm saying? Like you can say, so instead of saying, I don't know how to do this because it hasn't been done yet, you go, wait, this is the chance for me to say the way it should be done. Like, so for example, like the idea that you've got drawn all through your drawings, the idea of just bamboo coming to the ground. And I just like, the bamboo is not, Nicole, the bamboo is not coming to the ground. The bamboo is not going into the ground. It's just, it's, already there. There's a detail that you have to configure conceptually that's going to have tremendous impact on what you could do then inhabitationally, right? So I think there are less roads in from the kind of point of view of propriety and more roads in from the fact that as a student in this moment with bamboo, you're allowed to tell the professor what is right. You know what I'm saying? Like it's this kind of moment where you take charge and you own, which I think is like spectacular. It's just, own it kind of thing.
Yeah. Wow, thank you so much. One thing I wanted to add to, everything that has been already said is that I think Nicole did an amazing job in actually really immersing herself in this project and in the landscape and in the life of this plant. And to me, where it's really visible is in the sections. And I was just, it was such a pleasure to watch her develop that section. I don't know if you can put one of the sections up maybe for a moment as we kind of wrap up. Was really seeing a student of architecture who is capable of reconsidering what ground is and reconsidering what we consider as the environment, which is normally everything above the section line, and trying to start thinking about the environment as something that just changes, from dense to less dense through different media, and how the roots and foundations are kind of inhabiting that space. And I think that this is really, to me, an incredible, journey that I've watched her go on, and even the idea, of embracing the system, which might be still a little bit rigid. It doesn't fully yet, maybe get the intricacies of bamboo construction, but the fact that she actually decided to embrace a system that was not something that she saw somewhere and just replicated, but really worked through it was really incredible. And it went through a number of iterations of different trusses and different systems, and it did acquire some flexibility in response to different spaces. So I really wanted to congratulate you and say it's been a pleasure watching you on this journey. Thank you.
Thanks. Well, I've enjoyed working on it, and I thank you so much for all of your feedback. Took lots of notes, so I will be doing lots of research.
Wait, Nicole, can I add one more thing to your list of research?
Yes.
Like, so you started with that whole thing about the colors, and I think that this is like latent in all these discourses has been the kind of question about, how the way you think about things might change as a question of reconsidering certain sets of values, right? So even a thing like color and how you achieve it and how you get it, I think is this really, so in that kind of Polynesian landscape, the way color is gotten by taking many small things of color and combining them in like those feather blankets or the, or leis even, right? Like taking many small things of color as opposed to imagining it as a pigment, right? So, I just think that there's this kind of like you're at this kind of beautiful moment. You have the skill sets, you have the way of drawing, you have to literally letting all of those reconsiderations liberate what clearly is you already have the tool sets for. I just more power to you. Yeah.
Thank you. Well, thanks for Thank you for being here, Alicia. Thanks a lot. Thank you, David. Well, Coleman never popped up. Sean will be back later, so we'll have him back, but I really appreciate your comments. Thanks for being here.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks for having us. Yeah. Yeah, it's beautiful. I wish I'd been able to come earlier in the semester. I just think these problems, I think, first of all, the problem of hot and humid is just so interesting.
Yeah.
You know, it's like, yeah, plus Hawaii is just like, oh.
I know, you know, I almost feel that this should be a studio in 2 installments, like fall and spring, fall dedicated to plants and landscape, and spring to architecture, because it's really so much to pack into one semester that it would make a perfect kind of double studio.
I mean, all the comments that were said right now in the research, the amount of time takes time. So obviously, you know, then I guess that's the 16 weeks. I don't know exactly how many weeks you have.
Well, 15 minus 10 days that we lost to the
so that is...
It was tougher than that because the storm really knocked us out for 3 weeks when everything else recovered, because it killed everything going into break, and it was just nuts, you know. But the one thing,
was really hard.
I just think that like I know that a lot of students are feeling down about that, but all the faculty are aware of this, and all the discussions. I think that you go into these kind of final reviews, you should be more very positive about like going, it's a working discussion about where I am and what I did and so forth. And anyway, whatever. Alex, thank you so much. Alicia, so nice to meet you. Yeah.
Same.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Okay, guys, so I will see you at 3 o'clock. Okay, thanks a lot. Have a Hello. I don't know if hang on, let me just see. Hi, John.
Hi.
Hello.
Good to be here.
I'm just still waiting. Oh, Victoria is here. Hello, Victoria. Hi.
Guys.
Hi, I will introduce you in a moment. I'm just still waiting for Cisco and Sean, who might be late, but he was with us before. So just give me 2 seconds.
Okay.
We only have 2 projects to review, but we've been surprisingly taking a lot of time to review each of them because the conversations got long, and the presentations have been also long because we've had a lot to say. So I'm glad that we don't have more than 2 projects per session.
Okay.
I'm excited to see it.
Yeah, well, Victoria was with us for the midterm. Hang on, I'm trying to adjust my volume. I'm sorry. Okay.
Can you hear me fine? Am I too loud or something? No? Okay.
Sounds good.
Hang on. Can you hear me now?
That's good. Yes.
Okay, perfect. Okay, fantastic. Okay. I would like to wait at least for Cisco so that.
That's fine.
Yeah. John, did you have a chance to look through the brief, the syllabus?
I read not the syllabus, but the program description. I have it right here, so I can look through the syllabus also.
Okay, great. Okay, great.
Okay.
And one thing I can do is copy. If you prefer, sometimes it's easier to see the work on the Miro board. So I will also post it here. So this first link, that should be to the final projects. And then, well, I think that should be enough, yeah. It's the same that you have in the PDFs, it's just all together on one board.
project has some very minor differences from what's uploaded. So we made a few very minor changes as we rehearsed our
Okay,
project.
that's fine.
It's close though.
Normal.
Oh, and then is the work posted?
Did you have also, do you want me to send you the link to the PDFs again?
I have those. I just want to see if the work is on Box or not.
Yeah, it was on Box. So hang on, if I can retrieve that link for you
No,
again.
I should have it right here. This is, oops.
It's in the main file, you know, yeah?
Yep.
Okay, fantastic. Oh, Cisco is here. Great.
Good.
Hi, sorry.
Hi, Cisco. No problem. We'll just, yeah, I think we can start. So let me just introduce our reviewers in this final third session. So we have John Blatt with us, who is a professor here at UT. We have Cisco Gomez, who is also a professor here and our Dean of Academic Affairs. And then we have Victoria Barbo with us, who is an independent practitioner with Resonant Matter in New York. We should also have, in a couple of minutes, Sean Connelly and Rick Barboza, who are both in Hawaii. Sean is an independent practitioner. His studio is called After Oceanic, and Rick Barboza is basically the owner of the nursery that we've collaborated with. So they will be joining a little bit later, but they've been kind of following us on and off, so they know the project. And if you had a chance to read the syllabus, Cisco, did you have a chance to read through it?
Yeah. Yes. Yes.
Okay, great. So Victoria knows the work because she was with us for the midterm. But I just wanted to emphasize maybe a couple of things before we start. One thing was that for me, the fundamental kind of ambition here was to really expose the students of architecture to plants and make sure that the plant becomes a protagonist in this project rather than just a decoration in the final drawings, which is often the case. So this, of course, also meant that due to the time constraints, the architectural part of the project did not, get as much attention as in normal studio. It was slightly compressed, and that unfortunately was made even shorter because of the winter storm. So you will see the effects of that a little bit, but anyway, that's one thing I wanted to emphasize. And the other thing is the importance of the collaboration with Sean Connelly and Rick, who not only allowed us to really gain a more intimate understanding of the natural dynamics and the cultural applications of some of these plants, but Rick was the person who helped us choose the plants that we worked with and kept on helping us to basically find the information that we were missing as we were working on it. So this has been very important. Okay, so we have two, and Cisco, you were not here. I don't know if you see in the chat, but I also posted a link to our Miro board. This is just the same final projects that are on the in the box folder, in case you prefer to see all of it together, and that way you can quickly also see the projects that you're not seeing for context. Okay, so we have, first of all, Ken and Justin. You can take over whenever you're ready.
I think we're ready. Justin, you ready?
Okay.
Yeah, ready.
Go for it.
Hi, I'm Justin Perkins.
And my name is Ken Sneed.
Our research focused on Colocasia esculenta, or more commonly known as Calo. Next slide. Haiku Agricultural gathers modern and traditional Hawaiian ethnobotanical practices, the incubator for future Hawaiian agricultural autonomy, and the confluence between Hawaii's native flora and its people. Next slide. Kalo is one of the most important plants of indigenous Hawaiian culture, where the oha, or corn bud as seen in pink, is mashed down and turned into poi. Fresh poi is used as a staple in the luau ceremony, as well as a fermented version that was taken on long hunting expeditions. Next slide. While the consumption of the kalo corm is the main driver of cultivation, the whole plant is used within Hawaiian culture. As stated earlier, the corm is mashed down for for food as well as medicine. The huli, which consists of the top of the corm and the bottom stem, are used as cutting to propagate the plant instead of natural pollen fermentation. The leaf and stem are used for livestock feed. And lastly, the leaves and flowers can be used for food or decoration in a burial ceremony. Next slide. Poi production is an extremely ritualistic and knowledge-based process with the corms first being harvested from the lo'i ponds, then washed and scrubbed to remove their toxic skins. A small portion of the skin is left on to provide for the bacteria that allows for fermentation. After that, they are cooked and consumed in a traditional underground stove known as an imu during the communal luau ceremony. Next slide. Even though kalo is integral to Hawaiian culture, its production has been decreasing in recent years. And compared to the agricultural land as seen in the diagram, as seen in pink on the diagram, the kalo production is relatively small with the dark red dots. Next slide. Our site is on the northeastern edge of Oahu. The region historically and culturally has a relatively large portion of kalo cultivation. And we just want to highlight the dash in the bottom left. The dash zone is our site. Next slide.
Traditional Hawaiian society organized around the ahupua'a, an economically and ecologically self-sufficient system of land division extending along an individual watershed from the mountains to the ocean. Kalo pond field agriculture, known as lo'i, was central to the ahupua'a. All resources needed to grow and process kalo into food was found within the ahupua'a's boundaries. Hawaiian society developed two distinct types of pond field agriculture. The first, ka lo'i, occupied the banks of perennial streams, diverting water into the pond fields before re-releasing it into the stream course. The second type of lo'i pond field are stone-lined terrace matrices constructed on the steeper valley slopes. In terrace pond fields, water is retained in upslope reservoirs and slowly released to the pond fields by gravity. Lo'i are constructed by excavating a shallow depression and flooding it with water. Banks are reinforced by organic and inorganic materials and made water fast. Kalo thrives in inundated environments where other crops can't survive and are shade tolerant. So banana, sugarcane, and other staple foods can be grown along the banks of the lo'i without impacting pond field productivity. A large volume of water flows through our site. A perennial stream cuts through the north section, but this area is culturally protected and so is off limits to building. Water also consistently flows through the middle and south sections of the site, shown here in blue and green. This water is currently unutilized and the resulting surface runoff enters concrete-lined stormwater ditches downslope of the site. Our calculations suggest that of the approximately 350,000 cubic meters of water falling annually on the watershed upslope of the site, about a third ends up as runoff entering the stormwater system below. If retained temporarily on site, this water can support approximately 5,500 cubic meters of kalo agriculture. The terrain of the site has a moderate but consistent slope, suggesting that the stone terracing method of pond field agriculture is viable on our site.
We just want to point out that the site is mainly overgrown with invasive bamboo. And then also, as seen in the picture on the right, the site is surrounded on three sides by kind of classic Hawaiian mountains and cliffs. Next slide. The site has multiple infrastructure elements, most notably a large power line going through the middle of the site and a large drainage ditch on the eastern edge of the site. This photo on the right specifically is showing the ditch further in the neighborhood looking east, but does show the size of the drainage diverted from our site. Next slide. As noted earlier, we deeply analyzed the water flow across the site. These forces actually provided our main ordering system for the project. Where the highest concentration of water flows across the site, we began to place lowy ponds parallel to the contours, then subtracted the ponds in relation to our programmatic needs and the available water flow across the site. The size of each low E element are based on satellite photos of existing ponds in the surrounding area. Next slide. With the main access road on the north side of the site, you can begin to see the infrastructure of the actual low E ponds in dark blue, as well as the paths and residual low E substructure that tapers off across the site in relation to the low E. We just want to point out again that denser vegetation in this drawing highlights the site's existing drainage paths. Next slide.
Where was the drainage ditch that you showed an image of on that site plan?
So that drainage ditch that we were looking at is if you're standing, can you see my, here, I'll annotate it real quick.
I can see, I can see.
If you're standing right there, you'd be looking back up into the site here. That's where that image was taken, is from this point, looking back towards the site.
Thank you.
Okay, give me a moment here. Let me get off the annotation.
This perspective from the southwest corner of the site provides an overview of the structure of the lowy ponds in relation to the topography and surrounding site context. One aspect to note is that our site borders the Stairway to Heaven, an extremely popular summit hike on the island. So we created an access point for guests to easily connect with this hiking path. This vantage is actually taken from that access point. Next slide. While the underlying ordering system is the lowy ponds, we wanted to create a dichotomy between the more private research facilities and the public-facing guest services, with a crisscrossing pattern that provides separation between the two elements, with one focused area where they intersect to allow for presentations and dissemination of knowledge. Next slide.
The concept of intersecting pathways informs Haiku's program distribution. Visitors enter through the northeast corner of the site, while staff enters through the northwest corner. Visitors are greeted by a cafe and welcome center upon arrival. The two paths intersect in the center of the community complex, which includes a communal dining area. From this junction, visitors can either proceed uphill to the private residences or downhill to the community pool and poi processing building. The lower path proceeds past the pool house and poi processing facility to the building that hosts the nursery and kalo processing storehouse. Beyond, staff access the research center and ethnobotanical gardens. Both staff and visitor pathways lead to the Stairway to Heaven trailhead at the southwest corner of the site. Here we focus on the nursery and kalo cultivation storehouse on the east side of the site, visitor residences on the west, and the terraced lowy pond fields separating the public and private areas of activity. Abundant operable fenestration allows the indoor environment to be enclosed or open to the outdoor environment as conditions allow, welcoming ocean breezes from the east and allowing occupants passage along the lanai, the veranda that surrounds the enclosed spaces. The lanai are covered by deep roof overhangs, channeling ocean breezes through the open structures and providing generous shade and cover from rain for the lanai beneath. Similarly, the building that houses poi processing and the pool house are permeable to the outdoor environment, strengthening the connection between the activities of the occupants and the hybrid constructed natural environment beyond.
This perspective is on the northeastern edge of the site from the entrance of the guest service parking lot. Again, we'd like to highlight the underlying lowy walls and how that substructure relates to the foundations of our buildings and their interaction with the typology of the site. Also, the infrastructural nature of the project speaks to the elements surrounding the site, like the highway overpass and the power lines. This longitudinal section is taken from the guest services entrances, then cutting through the main pathway intersection point and up into the visitor residences. Most notably in this drawing, I would like to point out that the close proximity from one building to another. It allows for their floor plates to connect with each other, turning the cantilevers instead into spans.
So I'm going to change just really quickly so we can zoom in on this section here. So cutting the middle of the site transversely exposes the stormwater ditch that follows the downhill boundary of the site, the lower path, the fish pond, the community pool, the terraced pond fields, the residences, and the upper path, and the edge of the Haiku Valley forest upslope of the site. Native plants enclose the site along its edges and inhabit the spaces in between. Human and non-human inhabitant activities, building form and construction methods, and areas of botanical cultivation are conceived as part of a constructed landscape integrated into the surrounding natural environment.
Thank you for your time, and we look forward to your questions.
Thank you.
Can you go back to the site plan?
The program plan or the site plan?
The site plan.
This one right here?
Yeah. Sorry, this is so just wrapping my head around what you've done. You talked about, I appreciate the analysis of the, what are they called? The ponds, the
Lowy
ponds?
Lowy, yeah.
You know, that's I'm farthest thing from an expert, but I'm familiar with landscapes that are terraced for agriculture, and many of them have walls that are built along the lines of the contours, parallel with the contours. I wanted to ask about, you mentioned in passing that the size of the cells was derived from an analysis of looking at existing pond conditions. I wondered about these walls that are perpendicular to the contours, and what their purpose was. Like, is it necessary that these be divided longitudinally into segments as well? Or maybe they are just traditionally? I don't know.
The reason that there are some going perpendicular to the contours is because there is a need to be able to access the ponds upslope of the ones that border the east side of the site. So the staff is able to walk up these along the walls that are going perpendicular to the contours in order to access each pond and go in and work with the plants.
Okay.
It's also just for structural stability to help to keep the walls from giving out under the weight of hydrostatic pressure.
As well as like separation between different ponds too, because depending on what stage the Lowy is growing in, it needs more water.
That's right.
On more mature it is, the more water it requires. So it's a greater subdivision that allows for the control of how much water is in each pond.
Yeah, you flood it, and then you might need to increase it as the plants grow to keep the roots submerged, because that's how they grow. But you don't want to always keep the whole plant submerged. Otherwise, it can become weakened, and then it'll be vulnerable to bacteria and other things like that, fungus.
And in one of the transverse sections, you had a swimming pool or
Sure.
a swimming.
Should I go back to that?
No, I just wanted you to point out in the plan where
sure. That's right here. So this is the pool house. I don't know if can you see? So
yeah, I can see.
So this is the pool house right here. And on one side is the fish pond. And then on the other side is a pool, is a natural pool. And maybe I can go to the section if it helps for the dimensioning of things, because it looks like it's extending pretty far into the pool, but part of that is that the roofs are fairly cantilevered. They extend pretty far out, and so it's not very exposed in plan view, but you can get a better sense of the pool in section. it's not a large pool, but it's enough for, you know, several people. Should I go back to that section?
No, it's okay. I'm just trying to get a sense of where everything is. And then I'm assuming these two pieces are collecting water for the whole system from the ravines.
Yes. So this one is this one here is where the majority of the water comes down onto the site. The vast majority, like 80, I would say 85% of the water comes, and it's held in a reservoir before being released by gravity along the pond fields. This one right here is more of a water retention pond and a water feature separating the parking lots. There's less water that comes here, but this is not connected to the pond fields over here. These are parking lots. I know that they, in this drawing right now, they're showing up as about the same tonal value as the low E, but this is more of a water retention pond and with aquatic plants growing in it, but not part of the low E cultivation system itself.
I had a question about the program. Maybe we can go to the other slide that kind of outlines the different facilities.
Sure.
And maybe
the site plan that looks similar to this.
Yeah, exactly. And maybe you can speak, because you kind of alluded to it, how they are connecting, because you had the diagram, I remember from last time as well, that you were kind of talking about these meeting points. Maybe you can go a little bit more into detail where or how you thought about that.
Sure. So as we said, that there are basically two separate paths that cross each other in the community center. So there's a pavilion in the center of this area right here, and that's where the intersection occurs. Visitors come in from this parking lot here in the northeast side of the site and can move up here into the community center and then beyond into the residences, which are part of the upper part of the site. Staff parks in this upper parking lot, and there's some facilities maintenance building here, and then that path also crosses through the community center and then traverses along the lower edge of the site, along where the poi processing facility is, and the nursery and the storehouse for the agricultural cultivation, as well as a research center back over here. And then they meet up again at the far end of the site, where the pathway connects to the trailhead to the stairway to heaven.
As you go further south, the paths become more private, with them just intersecting at that center point on the northern portion of the site.
Awesome, thank you.
Okay, so the brief asks you the syllabus or the specific program brief, either one. I don't think it matters, but it asks you to think like an architect. What does that, can you elaborate on what that means to you and how you've interpreted that in this project? It also mentions think like an ethnobotanist and like a botanist, et cetera. So there's and think like an artist as well. So there's a number of considerations, but when it says think like an architect, what are you taking from that, or what does that mean to you?
Well, I think that what that means to me is that the buildings, their placement, their construction, and the spaces that they create are set the stage for the activities for the program that's taking place on the site. And so the buildings per se, they create spaces that will both frame the experience of the cultivated spaces, but also frame the experience of the natural environments. Yes, okay. I think that's what that means to me. So it's the architecture takes a backstage to the occupant activities taking place on the site.
Okay, I think it's a really important question for you right now in your education. So it's because I was trying to imagine, if this is a presentation by a botanist or an ethnobotanist, it feels a little bit more like that to me. than a presentation by an architect. Not that I love architects more than botanists, I don't necessarily, but it sounds like it's heavily weighted in a sensitivity towards the growing of the plant and the nurturing of the plant and keeping the plant growing. I'm struggling a little bit to wrap my to see where the architecture is in it, which then leads me to the question of, well, what does that mean? You know, what does it mean? What does it mean to be an architect? I know that it's more than just problem solving. So a lot of this is connected to making things work. But I'm looking at the units, especially in the site plan, and they seem to be very, their position seems to be dictated by a specific localized attitude relative to the contours. Everything is placed relative to the contours, and the buildings seem to be very self-considered. That is, they're designed from how they sit on the ground and then develop singularly. And the space in between each of the structures looks residual to me. It's whatever is left over. So the sculpting of space or the carving of space, or to really like that consideration, I'm not reading in the site plan very much at all. It's very much secondary. So this is where I start to say it looks a little bit like if I imagine if a botanist were to lay it out, they might, each of these would work very, very well. They might sit on the ground exactly right. They might be placed in exactly the right way. But there wouldn't be this other thing that carried through. Maybe the space and organization of these things might be more important. But an example of this, the campus at UT, if you remember what that's like, maybe you haven't been there in a year or so, but if you remember that, it originally was a collection of buildings like Sutton Hall. Sutton Hall is one of the early buildings, and they're just like individual self-determined buildings, like objects that are scattered around in an open field. But then the plan of 1927 or 1930 or so made the spaces the dominant element. So the South Mall is the dominant element, and then the East Mall and the West Mall. And then buildings began to be subservient or secondary to that. So there was a real dialogue between the space and the organization of the spaces, which is interesting because it's not a thing, and the buildings, which then began to be secondary to that. And that seems like that's something that's there's an opportunity in this to start to explore that in a way that might be perhaps more strongly developed. Also talks about it in the program here, creating something which is about contemplation, transformation, and preservation of Hawaiian flora. So how do you facilitate, encourage, and optimize contemplation and contemplation? How do you do that? How does an architect, or how do you as a designer, while solving all these problems, because it's taken for granted that you're going to do all this in a way that works well, right? But how do you then maximize or optimize or encourage this condition of contemplation in the project or in the site? Now this takes it back to this section. Your sections are actually, I think, very, very compelling and very, very beautiful. But although I love the diagrams of the plan, I love everything in your presentation, and I'm set up to really sink my teeth into the architecture of your project, but it's like not there yet. So
can you elaborate on where one might go in order to start developing that in greater detail? Would it be in the construction of the buildings, in the space making? Can you discuss that?
Go to slide 20, please. It's the one that shows it's a plan, the larger scale plan.
This one right here?
Yep, that's good. That's good.
Yeah.
Forward one. One more.
One more back.
One.
Oh, this one right here.
Yeah, that one right there. So this is. I mean, for me, you can look at the composition of the frame to start to see where somebody's intention is, and this very much is about, I think, very successfully talking about the heart of the project is really with these things right here. My criticism, because I feel I'm supposed to be as harshly critical as possible. Is that correct? I'm trying to remember what my job is. Okay, let's just say I was going to be as harshly critical as possible. I would say these things look a little bit too self-contained, like a self-contained hut that one might find on a mountain hillside built with indigenous intention. Now, there's an entire argument that says what's wrong with that, but that's a different conversation. What I'm looking for is what you're bringing from yourself and your background into these things. What I'm trying to see is how these buildings might start to connect or relate to one another at the same time that they are secondary to what happens with the plants and the nurturing and the development of the plants. So that while you are in one place, you might start to develop a sense or an awareness of what happens in the other place. And then and then this little flag goes off in my head that says, talk about the way Japanese gardens are laid out. And then I realize I don't know enough about it. I know that there is something about the way that the landscape is an important part of how these buildings as objects or pavilions or huts or singular objects are placed in a dynamic balance with the landscape in a way that it tells you a story or that it leads you together, and that there might be a lesson in that. And this is where it's on my list of things to understand better. But as I'm in one place, I might have a very strong sense of awareness of who this person is over here and what happens in that place, and it might in some way lead me across into another, so that my whole experience of the place would be more than just understanding the plants in the center and the collection of these individual elements, but it might be a collective experience that's woven across the entire site in some possible way. Now that might be the case. I'm not sure. I don't see it yet, and it may in fact be there.
I think that, like, for example, in this section, you can see that there, and maybe in the perspective, like, you can see that there is a visual connection between the activities that are taking place on the lanai, the opening up of the buildings, the sense that there is a separate section above and below, but there is the thing that's connecting them is the plants that run as an axis down the site. So I think that like the visibility and the understanding that there is a connection between the activity going on down here and what's being supported up here. But based on our diagram of the crossing paths, we didn't want the buildings to start to meld together or take over that center area of the low-E and the kalo production, because that was the central focus of why people are on this site.
Okay.
But I think like visibility and the openness of the buildings, the ability for the buildings to open up and become permeable and porous and to see into these more open spaces, that there's a visual connection between them, even though you can't necessarily, and we don't really want people to necessarily come down across these like that.
Okay. Yep, that's fine. That's fine. I'm just looking to see if there's some untapped potential that exists within these things. Right now, go ahead and back to that slide again, please.
This one right here.
That one right there. Yeah. So these I'm looking at the decks. I'm reading them as decks because I'm not sure that's the right word, but this
lanai.
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 Okay. So what's the definition of a lanai?
The lanai is the Hawaiian the word for veranda, or it's the platform that surrounds the enclosed space to allow movement around the building that's not natural, but allows you to experience the outdoor climate and the views without having to be in an enclosed space.
Perfect. That's a great element. That's an element I might examine a little bit more closely and perhaps maybe elaborate on or apply some of a creative approach to it right now. This, when I see it right here, starts to show an area that really either it's not occupiable or it doesn't invite occupation.
Right.
And I'm starting to just, so I'm wondering if the lanai itself might start to, I don't know, maybe break away from the direct attachment to the wall-like enclosure of the building. So you have the wall-like enclosure of the building as one of the elements. You have the lanai as the occupiable surface, which might, I don't know, do whatever it does. Maybe it turns into something which is a connection. I don't know if that's a good idea or not. But the lanai is one thing. These walls which enclose the building might be a second system or a second element. The columns which hold the roof up might be a third element. And then the roof structure themselves might be a fourth element. So each of those four elements, instead of being directly connected to each other in identity, might start to be developed independently as different things. So some of them might have a program where they connect all the way across the site, like maybe the roof profile in some way might connect us all the way across this experience. The lanai as an occupiable surface might be something which moves us in a different direction. The enclosure and the site placement, I'm very happy and completely satisfied with that. And then maybe the structure starts to perhaps do its own thing, or maybe it's just, you know, fairly quiet. Or maybe it starts to suggest, you know, as column grids sometimes do, there's this other system, a grid-like system or field condition, which could be read as more universal, something which, like, you know, has its sense of a grid which could extend forever across the site in some sort of like Cartesian expanse.
I think that the grid system, at least for the way that they're set up on the buildings, and the buildings, if we look at the section, for example, do you mind clearing that, John?
Yep.
Clearing the annotation.
I'm trying to.
The grid is so the buildings are set up on the actual foundation of the buildings are set up on these stone walls, right? So the reason that they wouldn't conform to a Cartesian grid necessarily is that the stone walls themselves are integral to the support of the building itself.
Okay. No, I like that quite. No, I love your sections. Your sections are fabulous. I really, really like them. There may be some opportunity in the further development of the interior of the building for that central, because that starts to be like an analogy of the plant. The plant's grounded in a very strong way. It has a stem structure, and then the leaves, in a certain sense, branch out from that. It doesn't have to be literal, but it might draw some inspiration in the way that thing begins to work. So if it were maybe more legible in the enclosing walls of this upper structure or something, I think that might be another opportunity.
Sure.
That's a great point. Yeah.
Yeah, I would say, thank you. I agree with some of the points, and other points, I think, because I've seen the process of the project, I want to, you know, have a slightly different opinion maybe. So I think it's actually, what we've said, or what John has said, that the sections are really powerful, because I think what's happening here is the kind of interweaving of what your original idea actually was that came out of the midterm where, you know, you're literally living with the plant, the nursery, you're living with the water, and the water was the driving factor in your entire project. I mean, I love the idea. I think I told you last time that I love that you guys designed with water. I mean, as an architect, most of the times you're trying to get the water out after and try to like, find solutions, but now you're actually designing with it. And I think that's really powerful. And I think, because the interweaving of these kind of different levels where the architecture actually becomes part of the landscape is very visible here in the section. But then I think, it kind of like is not as visible in the plan, because you are like automatically try to kind of align certain things, and they kind of don't really work. So I agree that there's kind of misalignments, and maybe they need to be more pronounced in order to become more powerful. Because I think what was the driving factor of this entire studio, and which is the beauty of it, is that the architecture is not taking over the landscape, but is working with the landscape. But maybe sometimes you need to be more decisive as an architect in order to frame it then. And we were talking about the Japanese garden. I mean, I'm not an expert, but I was living in Japan for a while, and I was really fascinated by the way that architecture plays a role in framing natural landscapes, and mostly artificially made natural landscapes. They're not really natural, but the way that works is always by taking itself back, but then also being very pronounced. So I think what kind of gets lost, maybe also in the perspectives that you show us, is that we can maybe not read it as much because it's all black and white. And I think that's the only criticism I really have for you guys, is that I would love to see, you know, the richness of the site, and that will be the opportunity to show it to us. Because right now, which is actually, you know, philosophically, it's interesting because it creates almost like a field condition where nothing is really having hierarchy over the other, but in this sense, I cannot really read it. So I would love to see the framing, you know, I would love to see the materiality of these, you know, almost pergolas that you guys are creating here. And I think what's really beautiful is the different conditions of interweaving the different, you could say, living worlds. I mean, there's a term, Aleksandra probably knows it, Umwelt, the different umwelts of the different organisms. So basically, like, you're living with the fish and you're very close to them. So I think it's really interesting. It's almost provocative to live that way. But maybe sometimes as an architect, making more pronounced decisions and kind of almost being a little bit more provocative can be helpful. And I think it's really legible in your sections. It's not as legible in your plans because the shapes are not as refined. And maybe it's because they're all grouped together, so they read differently. If they were single elements kind of distributed, they would probably read different. So, but I think overall it's a really great project, and I love the idea with the water and the way that you found your placements on the site. So, thank you.
Yeah, you know, it's the sections, which I also appreciate, really drive home the astronomical amount of construction that's in this project. Like, just the amount of wall that you have packed into the amount of stone. And
like in a good way?
No, that's not a value judgment. It's just an observation.
All right.
I'm just thinking about how much wall there is there.
Right.
And I agree with a lot of what's been said. Can you go back to the site plan? For me, my critique, and I share some of the compliments that have been made, but for me, my biggest questions have to do with the pavilionization of the building. So I really appreciate the approach to the project and the planning of the landscape, this kind of segmented field condition of elements that are sometimes the ponds for the agriculture and sometimes more landscape elements. But the fact that that was driven by this careful analysis of what the slope's doing, where the water is coming from, the ravines and things like that, I think is very strong. Yeah, I think one of the most powerful elements is this larger figure in the landscape of the kind of flooded. And I think this relates to what John was asking, because this is such a strong move. It actually can hold its own against these bigger already existing elements like the natural ravines, which are larger figures in the landscape. And you, as has been said, you kind of created this field condition of segmented elements that you then infilled. But you never really talked about the decision to then follow up with an architectural massing strategy, which was pavilionized. You know, you kind of have all these elements in your land plan, and then, you know, you kind of treat them like suburban lots. Like every two elements gets a house, gets a living unit, and it occupies the middle of this element. That's the exact same strategy as what's happening here, right? There's a property line here, and you're going to plop a house in the middle. In fact, when you squint, this looks a lot like this. And maybe that was intentional, but you didn't talk about that. And when you responded to John, I think, you know, John's discussion of how these buildings could potentially relate across that flooded landscape, I think gets at this idea that there could be larger relationships or larger figures that begin to read across that area. And your response was basically, well, there's lanai on both sides, so there is a relationship. But you could have any configuration of buildings as long as there was a lanai on the residential side and a lanai on the more public side, that relationship would exist. And so I question that, be completely transparent, I question the decision to break up these elements into individual pavilions. I think there could be a strategy that actually would be more deferent to the landscape plan, where these buildings were connected, were the equivalent of row houses, where it's actually the edge against the water, which is the primary expression, as opposed to the individual corners of each roof in each building.
Sure. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
Sorry, yeah, I agree. I'm not cutting you off, am I supposed to?
No, it's fine.
Yeah. I agree. And one of the first things that I might do is look at the site plan, but instead of seeing it this way, just cut it through the foundation just above the ground. So you have like the roots of what each of the buildings are, and then start to see if there's some kind of overall relationship or logic to how those relate to each other, and the site or not the site. They could be something that's independent of the site. Because in a way, I mean, there's an exercise where, I mean, I think I'm probably just reinforcing what Cisco says, where like this singular body of water might start to be more singular and more of a body of water, and then these buildings which are in a relationship right now might be in a more decisive relationship with each other, and it's almost the same place, but their ordering system starts to change a little bit. And then just go up in space a little bit and start to see where the lanai and the occupiable platform that sits on top of those is. And perhaps it starts to be, maybe they're more like lily pads that float over this pond in a certain sense. So they start to be more figural and more, grounded on this center thing. And just gonna keep going from there. There's a lot of sensitivity, a lot of good work here. Nice.
Yeah, it's I think where there's a lot, where the intelligence I'm really admiring is in those larger relationships. Like I love this idea that it's connected to a circulation path that's important to the community. And the diagram of the crisscross paths is very clear. The one thing it is kind of creating is a situation where the primary path, which might be used by others, people who don't really belong to this community, is bringing you by all the living spaces. I wonder if maybe this should connect there and go past them.
As far as that's concerned, so this is actually right now is the back secret entrance to that trailhead. The trailhead is actually like a quarter mile. You got to walk under the highway. Okay. But this is like the super secret off limits currently because this is government controlled land. But because the site will now be occupied by this center, this cultivation center, it becomes more like the back route to get to the actual trailhead, which is about a quarter mile away. So it's right now it's only the people who are willing to risk arrest that access it this way.
It's actually not accessible to the public right now because it just needs badly needs maintenance. But I think what they're suggesting here is that in the future there could be some kind of a connection. But I think what Cisco is saying is important, that if you are suggesting an access, making it into more public access and thinking about how people would actually move through this site once the public is allowed, public that is not just interested in this particular plant and the Loei fields, would be important. So yeah, exactly. So thinking maybe about how that path works better to serve the public, and how you would have to maybe slightly differentiate the project in order to make sure that people are not passing through like research facilities. That could be also another layer, right? Thank you so much for all the comments. I don't know, Sean is here. I know that you've joined. I don't know how much you've seen. If you want to make some comments, but feel free not to if you joined too late. I think that what I found really fascinating about this conversation is, the issue of systems that emerged and the potential for this project to kind of evolve as a layering of different systems that are independent and have independent logics, and then started somehow negotiating. And right now it's clear that the Loei system is the one that drives everything. The architecture is a secondary system that came in later, and it did acquire a lot of flexibility from where it was initially. So I have to say that, you guys really pushed it, but it's still very self-referential in many ways and fragmented in ways that could be questioned. So I think there was a lot of important, many important comments that you got today that could help you push it further.
The discussion reminded me, I don't know if you know the house by Sutu Demura. He did one of his houses is in one of these terraced landscapes, I think probably in Portugal somewhere. It's in, I think, the Douro River Valley. But that's a landscape where, I don't know if they're growing almonds or olives or what, but it's stone walls that parallel the contours. So they kind of wind around. Yeah. And that house is also an idea about a house that is different to landscape, but the entire house is, it's made of concrete and layered with stone, but the entire house is about the edge. It's a stone wall on the outside, and then it's embedded in the ground. It doesn't really have a figure in and of itself. It completely borrows the landscape expression for its exterior expression. So, I mean, it's just another way to go.
Sure.
I do think, looking at the sections, given the climate and the interest in the lanai, this idea of kind of a structure, I think it was in the section that, this idea of kind of a central structure. John referenced this a little bit, but it reminds me a lot of Jean Nouvel's Maison Tropicale, which was kind of a centralized structure. In that case, it was moment frames with, but the idea was the perimeter is completely freed of all responsibilities.
Yeah.
And so it can be very light or flexible. And so I think you have a construction system which is similarly intelligent.
Yeah, I also see a lot of intelligence in the section and a lot of promise in the section in terms of integration of different systems and architectural kind of novelty that could emerge from that. And I definitely agree that the plan could kind of evolve further. But great work, guys. Thank you for the comments, and let's move on.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. So it's Maddie and Michael, last but not least.
Hopefully not least.
Hopefully not. Sure not.
Okay. Is it playing nice?
Yes. Yeah, you're good.
Perfect. Okay.
You do have one of those funny squares on your screen that is covering the top of the screen, which might disappear later, but it's the sign that you have something maybe covering it from like a window from a software or something.
Yeah, it's my Zoom controls. Let me see if.
Oh,
I think
okay.
if you share the I think that if you share the screen rather than share the program, that will disappear. Was that present during my presentation, during our presentation too? That bar? It was not. So I just shared my screen rather than sharing the application.
Well, that's what I did. But we try one more thing. If not, we'll just roll with it. Is it still there?
Yeah, it is.
That's a bummer. All right.
Let's see, maybe it disappears. Just
we'll get started. Sorry about that. Okay.
It's okay.
So I'm Michael West.
I'm Madison Vincent.
And we'll be taking you through our Koko'olo tea pavilion. So first, we will introduce you to the Koko'olo plant, which we studied, which is a beggar tick that is endemic to Oahu, and it is it's a type of almost weed, a kind of bush that is very prolific on the island. It propagates very easily. There's a botanical plate breaking up those elements a little bit, and here. We studied a little bit just for some context where it likes to grow. It prefers higher elevations and moist soils, but it really can propagate just about anywhere on the island.
Yeah, and like Michael said, it's called a beggar tick, which means it has these like prongs on its seed, and in that regard, it sticks to fur, it sticks to clothing, and that's like its main way to propagate, as well as via the wind. And it's shrub-like in its form and reaches about 3 feet in maturity.
So the primary transformation of this plant as it relates to humans is it makes a good tea. And on here, we noted that it's believed that the flowers could have been used for lei, but it's not likely due to their size. So we focused primarily on the tea component as a way to connect this plant with humanity again, and as a way of really engaging with the plant and the landscape.
And like Michael said, it's pretty prolific on the island. And so the main way that these leaves are gathered is just by foraging for them and just going out and picking them yourself. And then this is just kind of breaking down that tea process. So the leaves are picked, sometimes the flowers as well. And they're boiled in a calabash bowl with some hot stones. And then depending on the strength of the tea, it just steeps for a few minutes.
So with a little bit of that in mind, we'll look at the site, which you just saw, so we won't spend too much time talking about it because you know the context, but there it is against the urban fabric in the valley of the Polo Mountains there. And so we started to pull from Sean's documentation pictures of the site.
Yeah, we were really interested in how a lot of Sean's videos, they just naturally started forming these glimpses and views that we really wanted to highlight. And you can see in some of these pictures that there's a lot of invasive species on the site, a lot of bamboo that's not endemic. And so we'll address that later on, but how we intend to address that. But just some views of the site. And then moving into some precedents, we really liked this idea of capturing glimpses and views and just kind of allowing the landscape to kind of set its own stage and tell its own story. And so this precedent in particular, we were really drawn to how the architecture just almost starts to frame these views and disappears at moments and reappears. And there's just, it allows for this natural progression through the site without feeling like you're forced down a certain path. And then here's some other precedents in terms of just capturing views, indirectly, a lot of Scarpa that we pulled from, and just really like this idea of very minimal and intentional moments of interruption that allow for these glimpses and views to be emphasized.
So with that, the diagrams that you saw on the glimpses images we had earlier is what's represented here. We started with Sean's path because we were particularly interested with what the landscape was showing, what was there, and we wanted to try to capture that. So we took some of his videos that he had and we we noted some important points that we marked in red here. And from there, we looked at how we can start to connect them and zone out the site based on those, as well as what the program of the project required. And so as we started to connect those and generate a form by injecting the program into it, we landed on this partie that really took the form of this long wall that kind of grew and shrank based on the program and on what views it was trying to capture. And here are those same layers, just kind of pulled out in the valley behind it so you can start to see, as well as the site sections of the kind of greater chunk of the island, just to start to understand what the landscape is actually doing in those moments. But that brought us here.
So here's that just a site plan. You can kind of start to see this spine that's snaking its way through the site. And there's moments where it starts to break apart for allow for occupation, as well as just penetration, and really start to create these views.
Yeah, the two primary things to note looking at the site as a whole, in addition to what Maddie said, was the overall progression and loop that we created here, the way that it starts to create this procession as you move through the site, and how the walls, as well as the water features that we've started to introduce, will give you those glimpses and pull people into the site as it gets more dense, of course, along with the path that was included for more pragmatic reasons and stuff like that. And then we cut these are some site sections which we'll look at more in depth later, but we wanted to provide a little bit of context with what we're looking at as far as how it stretches across the site and relates with the kind of density of the area around it.
Yeah, and so having our main form being this big wall that snakes its way through, we wanted to kind of explore the different characteristics that this wall takes on. And so there's 4 different kind of types. This one, number one that you see on the screen is these monolithic concrete walls that are the main presence on the site, sometimes being 8 feet or taller, and just they're always kind of there to help guide you through the site. And then having some softer notes of like a green living wall that this wall starts to turn into. And you can see down here towards the bottom of the screen, it's it kind of is almost like an arrow towards our tea pavilion down there. And then this is just kind of an opportunity to grow our plant in a more controlled area, but also some other local herbs and some plants as well. And then the third type just kind of being some low concrete walls that these major monolithic walls that we looked at earlier just kind of die down and allow for like sitting moments and moments of pause. And then the fourth just being some retaining walls to kind of help mitigate that grade change that is present on the site. So the idea is like this wall is always constantly snaking through, even if you don't necessarily see it at some instances, but that it's always present in some way or form. And then here's just some materiality that we're thinking. There is a lot of invasive bamboo on the site. And so we do want to keep that integrity of the existing site while introducing more local flora. But we do want to clear some of that bamboo out. And so thinking of maybe making this concrete walls being some bamboo board form. And then the living wall just being like 2x4 living wall construction. And then the stone masonry for these sitting walls, whether that comes from some stone that we move from the site, and then the retaining walls just being concrete as well.
Where are the wood walls in the project?
They are, yeah. On this plan, you can see they're in red. It's very faint. Can you see that?
Yeah, I can see.
Okay.
Those are wood, like wood cribbing.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
All right. So we'll begin walking you through the plan a little bit just to start to, so you understand what we're doing.
Yeah, and then highlighted in these little red triangles is just some views that you'll see in the upcoming slides of some perspectives. But you'd start to see here, you kind of pull up into this parking area and you're faced with this big concrete wall. And then with a lower little wall towards your left, and that's starting to frame that view back towards this forested area right here. And then you're met with this path that you start to meander down. And the walls are just starting to split apart and just allow for these like glimpses and views to start to come into play. Yeah, and then here's just that perspective coming down the street, and then here at the fork in the road with the fountain kind of signaling that as well.
And as we move through, kind of in the meat of the site here, we're looking at the divide between the path that leads more directly to the pavilion and then the living units on the top side of this plan here on the other side of the divide. So this is where we began to cut some transverse sections, really starting to look at the relationship between those two wings of the project, if you will. And one of the two big takeaways we had in doing these were obviously expressing how much vegetation we really want to be present and divide the two sites, but also the grade change, how much higher the T pavilion side is from the living units down below. And here are those perspectives taken. This is between the living units. This is a view framing the town and ocean, kind of in the northeast of the site, and then those green walls. And so here we're looking at the T pavilion more closely, and again with the living units on the other side, looking towards the foraging area. Again, cutting those sections, looking at the relationship across the way, but also how the T pavilion overall is much lighter in structure compared to the living units. We wanted the T pavilion to be a little bit more light in regards to interacting with that landscape more directly, as well as it not requiring any kind of privacy. This is that longitudinal section taken facing that T pavilion, so you can see it again with the gradual slope change as it's moving from right to left here on the screen. And then here is the other longitudinal section of the living units with the T pavilion beyond it, so you can really see just how much higher it actually is there. And then of course, a quick diagrammatic section looking at that T pavilion in particular. And of course the views.
Yeah, this first, sorry, Michael.
Please.
Yeah, so this is perspectives kind of taken at that end of that green wall, and beyond these concrete walls is that T pavilion that you'll see in the next perspective.
Yeah, this one taken from kind of in the you could call it the kitchen area, but a lot of what we aimed to do here was set the stage for how they would, how the people running this would choose to use this space, especially because the Kokoelo is so simple, for lack of a better word, in how it's transformed. As we discussed earlier, you really just boil the leaves and that's it. We wanted the space to be very flexible in that regard. But anyway, so this is in that pavilion looking out towards the bamboo and the propagation beyond.
And then this is just kind of that last sequence moving through the site. You see that flex space down at the bottom left. And then this area we kind of envisioned just being a foraging spot. So the vegetation that's there just being respected and left alone and allowing to just grow, as well as planting our cocoa aloe in there and allowing for foraging.
Yeah. And then here's just one last transverse section through that particular area with the flex space. We didn't quite call it out, but there's an additional flex space on the other side of the loop that is used both for making tea, but also for other purposes, perhaps education and study. And then you also see on this the retaining wall, highlighting kind of how we're beginning to terrace out that area. Here's a close-up of that particular pavilion. It holds the same language as the tea shop with the main addition of a wall that starts to it frames out that loop that we were looking at earlier. And then here's a longitudinal section of that same area. And this is our perspective taken on the kind of living unit side of that same area. As you start to more towards living units and kind of dive back into the bamboo, you see the more controlled, uncontrolled propagation of the cocoa aloe on site with the land beyond. And so just to summarize everything, we want to read through this really quickly to leave you with. In studying the cocoa aloe plant, it is clear there is a direct connection between humanity and nature on both a biobotanical and transformational level. The cocoa aloe is useful in its capabilities to make tea, and this transformation becomes a mechanism for human engagement. This opportunity to re-engage and reconnect people with the local flora and surroundings took the form of a tea pavilion.
Currently, the site is populated by invasive bamboo, among other invasive species. However, there are still opportunities for local flora to flourish and coexist with these invasive species. The design aims to re-engage people with nature by respecting the current site conditions and create a new biodiversity of local and foreign flora on the site. The architecture takes the form of a series of walls that guide patrons through the site and captures glimpses and views of the surrounding nature, with the form itself being derived directly from the natural environment. The intervention frames this new biodiversity of invasive and local flora with minimal but intentional interruption.
As one moves across the site, they are guided by both walls and carefully placed water features to facilitate movement and meditative contemplation as one engages with the landscape. The architectural walls then unfold themselves across the site, allowing them to pass through them, around them, and occupy them. The tea pavilion itself grows out of this form and faces the natural cocoa aloe plant, continuing to reinforce the connection with the landscape. This way, the design aims to simply set the stage for creating a connection between humanity and nature and rebuild the relationship. So thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
If I may, so I think in your statements in the end, it really comes together, and I think it's a really beautiful project. I was, fortunate to be on the midterm review, and I thought, the thoughtfulness with which you guys are going through this is really beautiful. I wanted to ask you to maybe specifically talk about the placements of these different types of walls, because your precedence was Scarpa, and Scarpa's way of placing, materials and kind of contrasting them to elevate each other and frame views. Maybe you can talk a bit about how you went about it, if it's similar to Scarpa, if you what are decisions that you made, and why did you place, for example, the living wall in the areas that you did, just to kind of give us an idea. I have an idea about it myself, but I would like to hear you guys kind of say a bit more about that.
Sure.
Why
Maddie,
the different types of walls? Sorry.
Maddie, did you want to say, or do you want me to?
I think you could start it off. I might add on to it.
So initially, the original distinction was just low wall and high wall. And we wanted to use that as a way of starting to, as you probably remember a little bit more at mid-review, it was more about the height of the walls and how that was a way of starting to suggest it. And as you followed it, it started to create the forms. But from there, we wanted to start changing the materiality as a way of signaling what we are, sort of the area that you're in, as well as create that intrigue as you move through the site. So the green walls, for example, as you are processing towards the tea pavilion, it starts to put you in the kind of propagation of the copal in a very controlled way before you kind of get to the pavilion, before you see the more wild propagation in the kind of southern side of the site. And as far as materiality, Maddie talked a little bit about the different particular components. We wanted to try to use the bamboo on site and express that same characteristic in how we cast the concrete. The concrete, of course, also offering a more permanent kind of structure, with the living units being a little bit more private, a little bit more stationary in where they're placed, and then the pavilion starts to have a little bit more of a tectonic feel as it starts to, as you approach it, with the concrete walls in the pavilion serving mostly to frame out the loop that's already there, but the components that you actually really engage with are the more tectonic ones. So.
Right. Yeah. And kind of tying off of that a little bit, you can kind of see in like the living units, I mean, there's some exceptions, but a lot of these main like concrete walls kind of start to wrap around in a way and break apart as occupiable objects almost. And then the living wall is more of a framing mechanism per se. I don't know if that really answers the question, but.
Yeah, no, I think it's very interesting, because the whole thing, I mean, from your midterm presentation to today, it's all about the experience that you create. And I think it's a challenge for a project like that to find the right representation for it. And I think, sorry, it's really loud outside my door. It's really interesting how you actually guide us through it. And I think the very successful moments are the actual compositions that you make. I mean, I really like the plan. I think there's a lot of interesting moments in there. And of course, we don't know from the plan how high these walls are. And that's where it starts becoming like this interesting framing of the natural environment that you are showing here. And I think it works really well. I mean, I'm a big fan of the way that you talk about it, also in your statement at the end, and the way that you're really celebrating that moment of the meeting of the plant with humans and kind of interweaving these two conditions. And I think in many cultures, tea especially is that kind of moment, the celebration of that plant in ceremonies. And I don't know about the Hawaiian ceremony. I'm more familiar with the tea ceremony, the chado from Japan. And the tea house in Japan is that really elevating moment of creating an entire ritual around the tea. And so it's really interesting that you guys are creating an experience to kind of engage not only with one plant, but with different plants in that specific way. And culturally, I think it's a really interesting thing. And it not only, because tea in a way in many cultures is also medicinal, so it kind of creates a different way of perceiving, right? Like, I mean, we drink coffee and tea all the time now, but it used to be different. So maybe like that kind of spiritual element is also really interesting, because you're not only changing your perception of the space through the walking through and that path that you create, but also through the ritual of drinking the tea. So it creates a whole new experience. And I think it's really powerful. I think it's a really great project.
Thank you.
I couldn't agree more. I love your project. I have a million nitpicks, because when you see something that you like, you want to draw on it and make it your own a little bit. But I'll get to those in a second. I did want to, one big question I had was you described the pathway as, if I understood correctly, a mapping of a video of the site. Is that right? It was a path, natural navigation path through the site as is, that was then captured with the walls. Is that? Yeah, these ones.
Yeah, it started out, so Sean provided us with some like site documentation, and he also provided us with like a little key map of like where he was when he was taking certain videos and photos. And so we started to kind of map some certain points that we also like were intrigued by. So it's like it's not a physical path that's currently there.
Okay. But it was a path that this irregular landscape was navigated. I mean, it's just interesting because it's I think it has a very appealing quality to it, and so I was just curious about its derivation. I mean, and you know, there's some reality to that. During the ice storm, I was climbing a steep hillside because I was trying to get cell reception so I could zoom into the ID accreditation report, and you know, you follow deer, like the paths that animals find in the landscape are actually you know, not random. They're paths of least resistance, and so I was just curious about that.
Yeah.
It is very appealing, and I think you know, my critiques are small ones. If you go to the site plan, I think the primary entry, you know, you're almost always moving alongside these walls, sometimes between, sometimes alongside, and so this moment where you this moment where you actually move through the wall perpendicularly, this sort of very strong threshold, I think is also very powerful, but having parking spaces right in front of it is not the right solution. Somehow the parking lot needs to be pushed forward or back, or you need to have a break. But I think that needs to be given space to actually operate in a better way as a pedestrian. You had a perspective of this moment, though, what you called the fork in the road, which compared to everything else you've done, I thought was weak. It just like this idea that there's I read it as a gravel path or some sort of not hard path. But given that you've got a vocabulary and architectural kind of syntax that allows you to move alongside walls or sometimes move between walls, I think I would have tried to avoid the fork in the road. Like maybe this wall can come out and be here, and so or there's an aperture through or something. But you don't have this moment where you go left or right. But actually, the walls help you help nuance that fork in the road.
Well, you could
that's a great point.
You could experience it as a loop, though. So in which case, the fork would be unavoidable in a way.
Right.
Yeah. You gonna keep nitpicking, or should
I am. I got more. I got just one or two more.
Okay.
Yeah. You know, one of the things I think is elegant about this is you're using essentially a singular device. Almost everything in this project is a wall, and with the exception of the living walls, they're all made out of. Well, they're not all made out of concrete. They're all made out of mineral stone or concrete. And I think there is some value in that kind of self-limitation. And so when the living wall became wood, which I didn't read in your earlier perspectives, it looked like it was sort of a carved away concrete wall. That to me is less appealing because it's sort of allowing yourself a degree of freedom that you didn't really need. And so I think I like the texture of the cribbing, but that could be done with concrete, precast concrete pieces. And I think it would be better because it would retain the attitude of doing a lot with a little.
It already exists as kind of precast elements for retaining walls along highways. So
yeah,
right.
Well, there's a great example of a small scale one. I think it's on 12th Street, East 12th. It's I don't know what it is, a school or government building that has a little retaining wall along the sidewalk. And it's literally made out of small, they look like parking stop size pieces.
Yeah.
Interesting.
I'm going to stop nitpicking because it's silly, but it's a very, very well done project.
Thank you.
Okay, I'll nitpick a little bit. I think I really like your project, but of course I feel bad about that because I feel like I'm supposed to, like, you know, be look for ways to make it better. So let me take a stab at that. The way that you've drawn the site plan, and I'm trying to understand how the ko'olau plant grows, if these are tall plants or not. And there's something for me that's a little bit disappointing about the way we're seeing the plants here. Oh, by the way, what's this thing over here?
That's I guess we forgot to mention that. That's a little cultivation patch, I guess, of our plant. But they're so small that
Okay, no, that's fine, because I was actually looking through. It's the slide before the last one. I could either share it here because I'm looking at yours, or you could jump to slide 55 or whatever it is. It's the one right before the text. Yeah, right there. Okay, so yeah, this starts to explain to me that the vegetation itself starts to have spatial qualities to it. Like there's low, tightly textured areas that activate the surface of the ground, or there's the ground plane itself as a surface. There's these things which are quite vertical. And these things have very, very powerful spatial attributes to them. So I definitely see it in this image right here. And it's the kind of thing that I heartily want to see reinforced in the site plan at the same time. If we could go back to this plan we were at before. Because what you've set up is this these two walls that define the site. There we go. Yeah, with inherently, anytime you're in here, you're going to feel the presence of the other wall. So there's a presence of zones that relay across like this. And so the design of the surface out here, like I'm still an architect that draws generic plants, so but if you start to think about it, these things, as you showed in that last rendering of the project, start to have real potentials to add another layer of complexity and richness into the project. And there's no reason not to include that in the way that you just indicate the surface of the ground plane that's outside here. As the more I look at it, the more I understand your project, and this is a wall that you move along, but it has the private residences on the other side of it. So it is a barrier wall to the general public, and I think it works pretty successfully that way. The transverse sections were a little bit, I was surprised in the transverse section at how quiet the slope is. It's less than what I just drew with that line right there. So it's actually pretty subtle. And I love the culmination with the T pavilion right here. And I like the fact that there's a nested couple of forms that really make a very elegant platform to linger on and to hesitate and to be in the middle of the place, but not the dead center of it. So it's like semi-pavilion-like. It's very successful. The roof of that thing is not yet developed though. It's just like two lines at the moment. So it's something which wants to float magically over the wall or have its own kind of special dialogue relative to that wall. So that's one thing that I think you just quite haven't gotten to yet that I would start to pursue. One other thing you might include about the walls or think about with the walls is if I were to, this is not a literal suggestion, I'm just trying to make a point. If I were to place a wall out here that had a level top to it, you would be able to very, very clearly start to read what the nature of the topography was. So having a wall which is counter to the topography makes a very, very strong reference element, like a datum element that you can start to really read the elegance and subtlety of what's beginning to happen in the ground plane. And I'm not sure that that's happening with these walls in your project at the moment, so much as it's a collection of walls that are almost all the same height everywhere. So almost all of them are, about the same height everywhere. And somewhere, might want to be very low and then be a wall that becomes very high. So there's an opportunity with this element and motif that you're putting through the project to really start to help us read the subtlety of what's happening in the contours of the landscape itself. But I think it's a very, very it's very elegantly done, very, I think, sensitively done.
That's interesting. Aloha, Sean here. I joined a little late. Yeah, I think that's an interesting idea with the wall, because then you're approaching the project, everything's framed, but then once you sort of get to the back of the project, it seems like that sort of experience kind of dissolves really quickly. And so I wonder how much, if it seems like your concept is being able to control the experience of the walking path through your project is pretty important to your concept. And so you have like a really heavy control on that at the very beginning, and then you sort of start to lose it at the end. But with that said, with the concept of the wall, looking at the sort of perspective views in the sections, I remember this from the midterm, and I do recall liking the idea of just conceptually, considering that you haven't visited the site and that you were given these site resources that you really honored the sort of initial site visit, so much so that it essentially forms the framework of your entire architecture. I thought that is an interesting concept, but I think ways that this project could be taken further with regards to the actual experience of the tea. The word percolation just keeps coming to mind with this project, and what would the concept of percolation add to this in terms of how the building connects to the ground, and then also the walls. The walls, it seems like the way that they're represented, ultimately, aside from framing and guiding the view, become sort of planter boxes. But I think that there's another level of sort of architecture that could be achieved there if maybe the walls took it to the next level and sort of extrapolated more of that percolation process. Because you're talking about tea, you're talking about making tea, and there's a whole process that happens at the micro level when making tea, that has to do with the way water interacts with the material of the plant, etc. So yeah, I just that would be sort of my sort of comment about, this is a really great design. I love how it is minimal. It sort of fits into the landscape. It really respects the experience of the site. And so, every project, could always be taken further. And so that's where I think I would have been interested to see the next level is to explore more how the actual process of the tea making, informs the architecture. Because then you learn something about the tea making process, right? Versus it just being a tea house.
Yeah, those are all really useful and interesting comments. I think that what John was, for example, saying about bringing some of these walls into the foraging landscape would be an amazing way to actually extend your presence in a very subtle way, but also allow us to kind of keep on feeling that we are still to some degree in a managed landscape, but in very, very subtle ways. Otherwise, I think that transition is true. It's very abrupt between what's constructed, even in lightly, but constructed and then left, natural. So I think emphasizing the fact that there's nothing natural here would be actually interesting, because this is not a natural landscape. You will be planting there, right? I love the comment that Cisco made about, the subtle kind of decisions about where to open the wall and how, you align the parking lot with that. Those are small things, of course, that could be strengthened. One thing that I would probably add to it, and as I said, we didn't manage to get that much into the architecture, but I think some of you kind of hinted towards this, is that there's a lot of potential to actually strengthen the architecture if you really started thinking about how this wall either starts really literally thickening to accommodate the enclosures in a more literal sense, or so that would be more like the Porsche maybe direction, where we, if you zoom in on, especially when we look at some of those the residences, if you zoom into one of the plans maybe, and so that would be one way. But the other thing is the relationship between the wall and the roof and the foundation, that could be so many different things, right? You could have a floating roof that is supported from the wall, but for example, through steel elements, and it's elevated. Or you could have a roof that is totally integrated with the wall, and we kind of really want to read it as a box. And I know we had some of these conversations, but we just, didn't manage to get to that level. So I'm just talking for the sake of talking and enjoying the, thinking about where this project could go further. We talked about the difference between, I don't know, mid-century modernism in California versus Olgiati, for example, right? It's like such different ways of thinking about what can happen to a wall. And I think that would be really fascinating to see where you would push those relationships, like what's the foundation and how that relates to the ground, et cetera, et cetera. So there's just so much that could happen here on the architectural level.
Or it could be a combination. It makes me think of Middleton Inn, which is a thick wall which contains the bathroom. You pierce it, and then you move into an additive element, which is the living space itself. The unit itself, as you have it now, is, I guess it's kind of a box within a box, but that L shape is maybe not the best spatial solution. But I will say, one thing I forgot to mention, when you talked about the planting and the tea plants, I was surprised and excited that the idea that you are really working with the circumstances of the site, including the invasive vegetation. The knee-jerk reaction is, and I'm not a landscape architect or gardener, so take this with a grain of salt, is I'm going to remove all the invasives and I'm going to return the land to its natural condition, only native species. And that was not your attitude, which I found refreshing. It's a little more tactical, a little more responsive to what you're working with.
Which doesn't mean that, sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, if you had more time, I think the next thing to do would be to really look at the pavements, even where they're not hard pavements, where they're gravel, and the topography. And, there would be some terrain modifications, even if very careful and subtle. And so actually working those out and getting into the next scale would be a really fun task on this project.
Yeah, I think, the moves, the moves that you're making at that scale right now are really interesting. And I would say, like, small details, while I'm looking at this project, I might emphasize certain walls more, extend them more, be a bit more drastic in certain moves. But I think overall it's a very elegant composition. And I think it's interesting thinking about now when you bring this project forward to kind of like what Aleksandra was saying, when you kind of push it forward to another scale, basically detailing it out. If you look at Scarpa, he's like excellent at that, bringing it from one scale to the next, to the next, to the next, kind of to the detail scale. And I think it's there's a lot of potential there, like the kind of like architectural thinking of decision making. When do you step back? When do you get more hands-on on certain things? I think there's a lot of potential here that I could see really beautifully being resolved. And I was actually thinking it would be super interesting for your own portfolio to think about how this project, I was thinking about that, about the previous project too, how these projects age, because it's a vegetation that will take over really quickly because it's growing, it's very vivid. So I would love to see what it looks like in 10 years when it's built. You never get to see that in an architectural, presentation, but I think it's really interesting to think about it, because that's the beauty about Scarpa's project as well, that they look different over time, and they look so beautiful because they're starting to get like a little bit, like worn down, and that makes them actually more interesting in a way. So I could see that in this project as well, because the minimal walls are not going to be concrete for very long. When you look at the Tadao Ando walls, they really change over time.
Yeah. One last thing that I wanted to return to Sean's comment about percolation and kind of more material dynamics, which I think is also a really fascinating way to think about how you could keep on going down in scale and ask material questions that would be very subtle, but engage with the climate, for example, and start thinking how you could maybe question whether this is a concrete wall, but some kind of a material that has a capacity to, manage this climate in a more appropriate way. So it could turn into, now I don't know, round earth is not appropriate for, for tropical climate, but going into material research in which just the idea of thinking about the process of percolation as a way to enter into material dynamics of climate control would be really interesting. Of course, this is not a studio for that, but I just kind of want you to think about that. You know, the engagement with the environment can go across all the scales, and it will be fascinating to engage with the climate on that level as well. Yeah. Okay. Fantastic.
Thank you, guys.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much for all your comments. And
thank you.
Yeah, it was great to have you. Thank you, Cisco. Thank you, John. Thanks, Victoria, and Sean and Rick. Rick is not here, but please thank
Rick did send me a message, and he said, if you could please relay to everyone how much I appreciate all the time, thought, effort, and artistry that was put into optimizing the functionality of the space. Huge mahalos, and he can't wait to watch the recording.
Thank you. Yeah, I'll share the projects with him if he wants to know more details, but I'm glad that he enjoyed it. Thank you, everyone. And guys, just hang around for a moment. Don't disconnect. I mean, John, Cisco, of course, Victoria, Sean, you can go.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Congratulations.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks. And before I forget, thank you guys so much for drawing all the roots. Last time I was kind of like mentioning the underground spaces, and I know it takes a lot of effort and time to research the roots and like draw them in, but I was excited to see it and kind of see the underground of the buildings as well, how they interact. Really cool. Thank you.
There's a lot of work in the drawings, and it's worth it. Pays off. Very nice.
Yeah, I have to say that this was an important conversation that we decided to kind of take on and really try to cancel the section line, which is of course, for us architects, a normal thing to draw, but we just wanted to see what it means to kind of just shift gradually through the different media that the environment is made up of. And some projects did it more successfully, others less. But I think that, it's an important project to take on and think about roots and foundations as kind of part of the same system that inhabits the soil. So thanks, Victoria, for that.
No, thank you, guys. Really, really great project. Thank you.
Thanks. Okay, great. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Okay, great. Thank you, guys. I hope that you enjoyed it and that you learned from it, like just different perspectives. I think that we, had good, really long conversations, which was possible only because we had, few projects to look at, but there was really a lot of richness, and I have to say that I'm very impressed with how you trusted me in a way, that you trusted this process of starting a project in a way that is not really conventional or common in architecture, at least not maybe at this school. And I know that it kind of meant a certain sacrifice in terms of how much you could push your architectural projects. Some of you still pushed it incredibly far, I thought, at different levels. And I know that most of our critics were architects, which means that they still focus on that aspect. But I know that they also appreciated the fact that you kind of stepped out of your comfort zone and engaged with those other worlds. I really hope that this helps you think about your next projects, whether they are still at school or in practice. Some of you are starting new jobs. Congratulations. Can we say it yet? Amaya, can we say it yet?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so Amaya just got a job with Michael True. She's gonna be joining the team there, and which is fantastic. And I'm sure many of you are graduating, so I hope to hear from you about the jobs that you're gonna be getting and aspiring to get. The most important thing is shoot for the best. Like, don't just limit yourself to what you think is feasible. Like, try. Certain things happen that you might not even think are possible in terms of where you could be working, who you could be learning from. So just try, and always know that I'm here. If you need references, I'm happy to support you with letters. But I diverted. What was I saying? Anyway, I just hope that in the projects that you will be working on in the future, that you really pay attention to this really multi-dimensional nature of the environment, and you could push it so much more further than what we've done in that such a short time, you know, looking at materials, looking at what we can learn from plants in terms of climate control. We didn't really do that in the studio. You know, this could have been a studio really just about climate control and thinking like a plant in terms of inhabiting this tropical landscape. That was just not enough for that, not enough time for that. But yeah, I hope that you enjoyed it. And please, you know, shoot me an email if you have any comments. I know you left comments in the survey, but that's a very formal kind of platform. And if you have any comments about the interviews, the conversations, I know we didn't kind of have enough time to talk about those outside of the conversations. So I'd love to hear from you, or now or later. Now you're probably just exhausted. You just want to go for a walk or just crash and sleep. So I won't expect much from you right now.
Alex, I was wondering if you're planning on doing exit interviews. I've done them for a number of my more recent studios, probably the past 3 or 4 studios, and I found them to be quite helpful in wrapping up the semester and understanding like the kind of lessons learned and kind of a guidance of where to look next. I know that those are things that we can kind of decipher ourselves, but I do find that those exit interviews are helpful for me personally. Is that something that you have any desire to do?
You mean to transcribe them? Is that what you were asking?
No, exit interviews as far as talking to us individually about our process and.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So, okay. Thank you for mentioning. Basically, if whoever wants to talk to me on Monday, we can do. I don't know what they call it, exits interviews or whatever they call it. What I will do, I will just create an Excel sheet, and then you can just sign up for a time, and you know, it's going to be during the studio time, roughly. So yes, so we can do that. And is that?
Thank you. Yes.
That answers question. Okay,
yes,
sorry,
yes.
I got confused. Yeah, you don't have to do it if you don't want to talk to me. It's not compulsory, but I'm more than happy to talk to you. And I think it's nice if we do it individually this time, because we haven't really had time to talk individually. So of course you can, you know, sign up together if that's what you want to do. But I think that's a good time to kind of maybe talk also about your next steps. If you have, you know, questions about applying for jobs or whatever it is. So yes, we will do that. I'll do it later today. And the only thing I want to ask you, if when you sign up for this sessions, please sign up in order. Like if just pick the first available, so that I don't have to hang around for 2 hours waiting for someone to sign up later. That's all I ask you for. Okay, anything else that I'm missing? Thanks for mentioning it. I would have forgotten. Any complaints, any comments, anything you guys want to just throw off? Well, I know I still have to grade you, so you cannot complain, sorry. Okay. Well, if you have no comments right now, just enjoy a break. I don't know if you still have stuff to write, exams, submissions, but you probably do, right? Yeah, okay. So I'll send you this email with the sign up sheet, and then I will be, you know, just grading formally the work. But I think the most important stuff you've already heard in the review. So for me, that's just a formality, really. Okay. Have a wonderful afternoon, evening, and thanks, guys. It was really a pleasure seeing your work.
Thank you.
Thank you, Alex.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye.